Section 1. The Last Heartbeat. There is a room beneath the surface of Terra that almost no one will ever see. It sits deep within the Imperial Palace, surrounded by so many layers of stone and adamantium and warded metal that the weight of the structure above it would collapse an ordinary building 1,000 times over. The corridors that lead to it are not corridors in any recognizable sense. They are more like wounds in the architecture, passages carved with agonized purpose rather than designed with any grace. The air inside them does not smell like air. It smells like ozone, like scorched metal, like the faint chemical signature of a place where enormous energies have been leaking for so long that the very stones have absorbed them. Servitors shuffle through the shadows, silent and purposeless, their biological components long since overwhelmed by the futility of maintaining a machine that no amount of maintenance can truly fix. And at the end of those corridors, past the custodian guards, who stand in silence so absolute it feels like a form of mourning, is the throne itself, the golden throne. It does not look the way you might imagine it. In the devotional paintings that hang in 1,000,000 cathedrals across the Imperium, it is rendered as something magnificent, a seat of blazing radiance, a construction of divine light from which a god-king surveys the universe with perfect clarity. The artists who paint those images have never seen the throne. They paint what their faith demands, and faith demands something transcendent, something worthy of worship. The reality is harder to look at. The Golden Throne is a machine, an ancient one, built during a time when humanity understood things about the universe that have since been forgotten entirely, an age of wonders that came before the long darkness. It is enormous. The scale of it defies easy description because the mechanisms that support it extend downward into the rock of Terra itself, tendrils of arcane technology reaching hundreds of meters beneath the chamber floor. The visible portion alone fills a room the size of a cathedral. Its surfaces are gold, yes, or rather, they are covered in a substance that resembles gold, sheets of alloyed metal etched with circuitry so fine it cannot be seen by the naked eye, inlaid with psychoreactive crystal and materials that have no name in any modern language. Cables as thick as a space marine's torso run from its base in every direction, pulsing with pale light. The hum it produces is not a sound so much as a sensation, something felt in the chest and behind the eyes and along the base of the skull. And sitting in it, if sitting is even the right word, suspended within it, held in place by mechanisms biological and mechanical in equal measure, is a man. He was, once, the most vital presence in human history, the mind that conceived the Great Crusade, that walked beside Primarchs he had shaped from his own genetic material, that fought against horrors that would have shattered lesser beings without pausing in their stride. He was present at the beginning of recorded civilization. He shaped early human religion from the inside, nudging mythologies in directions that would keep humanity spiritually grounded without allowing any single faith to calcify into dogma. He watched empires rise. He watched them burn. He survived everything. Now he does not speak. He does not move. His body is sustained by the machine around him and by the continuous effort of thousands of psychers who give their lives in shifts, feeding their psychic energy into the systems that keep him from dying. His flesh is barely flesh anymore. The Golden Throne has been part of him for 10,000 years. The boundary between biology and mechanism blurred so thoroughly that the Adeptus Mechanicus priests who tend to him cannot always determine where the man ends and the device begins. But he is not dead. This distinction, alive, technically, by any definition that has meaning, is the single most important fact in the Imperium of man. The entire civilization that bears his name, that spans roughly 1,000,000 inhabited worlds, that fields armies of billions, that maintains a bureaucratic apparatus so vast it has its own internal weather patterns. All of it rests on this one fact. He is not dead. He is alive. He sustains the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that allows navigators to guide ships through the warp. He holds shut a breach in reality beneath the palace that would, if opened, flood Terra with demons within hours. He provides the psychic template against which the souls of space marines are measured. He is, in ways that are theological rather than merely metaphorical, the load-bearing wall of an entire civilization. So the question that haunts the darkest corners of imperial thinking, that is never asked aloud, never written in any official document, never voiced in the presence of a custodian or an inquisitor, is the one we are going to spend the next hour sitting with. What happens when he dies? The Mechanicus priests know the Golden Throne is failing. They say so in technical documents written in code so dense it amounts to a private language. They have been saying it for centuries, the urgency sharpening by degrees with each passing generation. The systems that were never meant to serve as life support are degrading. Redundancies have been cannibalized to keep core functions operational. There are components within the throne that no one alive knows how to repair because the knowledge required died with the civilization that built them. Every decade, the margin narrows slightly. Every century, another function dims. The Emperor has not communicated clearly in 10,000 years. There are those among the custodians who believe he is still aware, still present in some form behind the ruined vessel of his body, that his mind reaches outward into the warp even now, fighting battles that no one else can perceive, spending what remains of his unimaginable will on keeping the darkness back. There are others who wonder privately whether what sits on the throne is still meaningfully the Emperor at all, or whether what remains is something more like an echo, a psychic impression too vast to simply fade, maintaining its functions through something like habit rather than intent. Neither group talks about what happens if the machine stops, because if it stops, when it stops, nothing in the Imperium has a contingency adequate to what follows. This is not a story about a battle. It is not a story about a single dramatic moment where something explodes or a villain wins. It is a story about the slow unraveling of a civilization that has spent 10,000 years pretending its foundation is not made of sand. It is a story about what the universe of the 41st millennium looks like the moment its most important constant becomes a variable. The Golden Throne has maybe a century left. Some estimates say less. The most pessimistic assessments, kept locked in vaults beneath the Mechanicus Temple on Mars, suggest it could fail within decades, and that the rate of degradation is not linear but exponential, which means the final stages will be sudden. When it happens, when the last function stops, when the last feedback loop closes, when the machine exhales its last breath of pale light, the consequences will not be contained to one world, or one system, or one sector of space. They will be felt everywhere, simultaneously. Let us talk about what that actually means. Before we go any further, if you have made it this far into this video, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing where these videos reach. And if this kind of deep dive storytelling is something you want more of, subscribing is the best way to make sure you catch the next one. Now, back to the throne. Section 2. The Golden Throne. What it actually is, most people within the Imperium do not understand what the Golden Throne is. That is not a criticism. The Imperium is not a civilization that encourages accurate technical understanding of its most sensitive assets. It is a civilization that encourages faith, obedience, and the suppression of questions that might destabilize the social order, and the true nature of the Golden Throne, if understood clearly, would destabilize the social order considerably. So, the institution of the imperial cult has spent 10,000 years carefully shaping what people believe about it. In the theology that the common citizen absorbs from birth, the throne is a seat of divine power, a physical anchor for the God Emperor's spirit, a sacred mechanism through which his will is projected across the stars. That framing is not entirely wrong, but it omits the part where the mechanism in question is a failing piece of pre-imperial technology that was never designed for the purpose it now serves, and that several of the most brilliant technical minds of the current age believe cannot be fixed. The truth of the Golden Throne begins in the age of technology, the era before the age of strife, before the Horus Heresy, before the Emperor's unification of Terra. During that period, humanity had achieved things that the 38th millennium would regard as the work of gods: stable warp travel, artificial intelligence, gene crafting at a scale and sophistication that modern Magos biologies can barely comprehend, even when studying its remnants. And the construction of the Golden Throne, which at that point was not called the Golden Throne at all, but was simply referred to in surviving fragmentary records as a kind of webway control interface. The webway is the Aeldari network of subspace passages, a system of stable tunnels threaded through the dimension adjacent to the warp, a kind of infrastructure built into the fabric of reality itself by a species that had mastered psychic engineering on a civilizational scale. The passages are stable, predictable, and closed to the warp in ways that make them enormously safer than conventional warp travel. No warp storms can disrupt a webway path. No demon can simply swim through the walls of a webway tunnel. Ships that travel by webway do not need navigators or Geller fields. They simply travel through a tunnel and emerge somewhere else, with the kind of reliability that conventional warp travel almost never achieves. The Emperor wanted this for humanity. His goal, the secret project he had been working toward since long before the Great Crusade formally began, was to extend the webway, to carve human-accessible paths through it, using technology he had spent centuries developing, and to give mankind a transportation infrastructure that would make the Imperium genuinely stable over long time scales. Warp travel, as it existed, and still exists, is fundamentally unreliable. Geller fields fail, ships are lost, warp storms close entire sectors for centuries. A webway route does not have these vulnerabilities. It is, in the most practical sense, better in every way. The mechanism that would allow this project to proceed was built beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. It was an interface device, a system that could connect to the existing webway and allow the Emperor to extend it, to literally construct new webway passages at a speed and precision that no Aeldari craftworlder or Homunculi could match. Because while the Aeldari built the webway with psychic power shaped over centuries, the Emperor's version would use human technology augmented by the most powerful human psyker who had ever existed. The plan, had it worked, would have taken perhaps a generation to produce results. Given enough time, it might have transformed the Imperium entirely. It did not work. During the Horus Heresy, Magnus the Red, acting on what he believed was a terrible warning, desperately trying to alert his father to Horus's treachery, smashed through the psychic wards surrounding the Webway project with his psychic powers. The wards were not just security precautions. They were the barriers that kept the Webway passages clean, that prevented warp entities from flooding through the interface into the tunnels, and from there, into the palace itself. When Magnus broke them, he opened a door that could not simply be closed again. Demons poured into the Webway. They reached the mechanisms beneath the palace. The Emperor abandoned the project. There was no saving it, and instead repurposed the interface device as the only thing that could now serve any useful function, a containment system, holding the breach shut by brute application of his own psychic power. And then Horus killed him, or rather, Horus came within a fraction of killing him. The battle aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, resulted in injuries so catastrophic that the Emperor's physical body was destroyed beyond any conventional repair. He was placed on the device that had become the only thing standing between the Imperial Palace and a demon incursion that would have rendered Terra uninhabitable within hours. The custodians, the surviving Primarchs, the servants who remained, they made the decision collectively, in a moment of terrible clarity, that there was no other option. The Emperor could not survive without the machine. The machine could not function without the Emperor. The arrangement was, in theory, temporary. 10,000 years later, it remains the arrangement. The Golden Throne sustains the Emperor's body through systems that the Adeptus Mechanicus describes as being in a state of permanent controlled deterioration. The redundant power systems that once gave the device considerable operational headroom have been failing since approximately the 33rd millennium. Each century requires new workarounds, new improvised solutions, new technical patches that address immediate problems while creating long-term complications. The priests of Mars speak of the throne the way a structural engineer might speak of a centuries-old bridge that has never been closed for proper maintenance, with increasing anxiety and a growing private certainty that the question is not whether it will fail, but when. There is also the matter of what the throne actually needs to function beyond its mechanical components. The Emperor, as he exists now, cannot direct his psychic power alone. His body cannot generate the energy required to maintain the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that burns in the warp and allows navigators to chart courses across the galaxy, purely through his own reserves. He requires a constant supply of raw psychic energy from external sources. This is provided by psychers, gathered from across the Imperium through the Black Ships, brought to Terra, and given to the throne in a process that is not entirely unlike being fed into a furnace. They are not sacrificed in the theatrical sense. The throne does not require death rituals. It requires psychic energy, and psychers who are mentally strong can survive the process. Many are not strong enough. 1,000 psychers are consumed by this process every single day, and even that consumption rate has had to increase as the throne's efficiency has declined. 1,000 lives, every day, for 10,000 years. The mathematics are not comfortable to sit with, but this is the system. And it functions, barely, in the current age, but it functions, because the Emperor still directs it. His mind, or what remains of it, still guides the psychic energy of those 1,000 daily psychers into the Astronomicon. He still holds the breach in the webway shut. He still maintains the template from which Space Marine Genocide is checked and corrected. These three functions alone represent a workload that would destroy any other psychic entity in the known universe, and the Emperor manages them simultaneously, every second, in a body that has not moved in 10,000 years. The throne is the foundation of the foundation. So, when the Mechanicus priests write in their encoded journals that the throne has perhaps 40 to 80 years of viable operation remaining, with uncertainty bars so wide they barely mean anything, what they are really writing is that the 41st millennium may be the last millennium of the Imperium as it currently exists. Understanding what happens when it stops requires understanding each of the things it currently does, and following each thread to its logical conclusion. Those threads, when followed, do not lead to orderly decline. They lead to simultaneous catastrophe across a million worlds. Let us pull the first thread. Section 3. The first domino. The Astronomicon goes dark. Before anything else happens, before the political consequences unfold, before the Xenos respond, before the warp begins its catastrophic overreach, there is a single moment that changes everything. The Astronomicon goes out. Picture what that means concretely. The Astronomicon is not a radio signal. It is not a navigation satellite. It is a psychic beacon of almost incomprehensible intensity, generated at the heart of the Emperor's power and broadcast from Terra outward through the warp across a range of approximately 70,000 light-years. Navigators, the mutant humans who guide Imperial ships through warp space, use it the way ancient sailors used fixed stars. They fix their inner eye on it, track its position in the swirling madness of the immaterium, and use its bearing to determine where they are and where they need to go. Without it, warp navigation is not merely harder. For a significant portion of warp routes, it becomes functionally impossible. The moment the Emperor dies, the Astronomicon does not flicker or fade gradually. It vanishes. The psychic structure that he maintains to direct the energy of the 1,000 daily psychers into a coherent navigable signal requires his active guidance. Without that guidance, the energy dissipates almost immediately, a diffuse wash of unfocused psychic noise rather than a directional beacon. Navigators across the galaxy, mid-transit in the warp, suddenly have nothing to steer by. Imagine being on a ship in a storm, navigating by a lighthouse that has guided you safely through these waters for years. Then the light goes out, not dimmed, extinguished. And the storm you are currently sailing through is not metaphorical, but literal. A churning sea of hostile reality where the currents change without warning and the rocks are made of something worse than stone. The immediate consequences are staggering in their scale. Every ship currently in warp transit that was navigating by Astronomicon bearing is now blind. The navigators aboard them will attempt to find alternative references. Some ships, particularly those closer to the galactic core or near certain stable warp features, may be able to navigate short distances by other means. But those alternatives are imprecise, require exceptional navigator skill, and only apply to a fraction of ships in transit at any given moment. The majority of vessels caught in the warp, at the moment the Astronomicon fails, face a choice between emerging immediately through the nearest available exit point, which may be nowhere near their intended destination, and may be in the middle of an empty space, a nebula, or the interior of a star, or attempting to navigate forward blind, which has a survival rate that varies between very low and effectively zero, depending on local warp conditions. In the days immediately following the Emperor's death, hundreds of thousands of ships are lost. The exact number cannot be known, because many of them never emerge from the warp at all. They are simply gone, swallowed by warp space and its inhabitants. Others emerge in the wrong systems, damaged or whole, their crews disoriented, their supplies running low. Some emerge weeks or months after departure because the warp distortions that follow the Emperor's death affect time dilation unpredictably. A ship that left Katia from Makragi 6 weeks before the Emperor died might emerge 6 months after, or 6 years after, into a galaxy that has already changed beyond recognition. The shipping lanes die. This is the part of the catastrophe that takes longer to become visible, but may ultimately be the most destructive. The Imperium is not self-sufficient at the planetary level. Most worlds in the Imperium specialize. They grow food, or they mine ore, or they manufacture a specific component, or they produce the specific kind of manufactured good that 40 nearby worlds all depend on. This specialization is efficient in stable conditions, but it creates fragile dependency chains. A forge world that cannot receive shipments of the refined minerals it needs cannot produce the machine parts that 5 other worlds depend on. An agri-world that cannot export its food surplus watches it rot in storage, while 300 million people on 3 other worlds begin to starve. The Imperium moves approximately 150 trillion tons of cargo through warp transit every standard year. Most of that transit depends on the Astronomicon for navigation. When the beacon goes out, the flow stops. Not immediately. There are ships already en route that will complete their journeys by momentum and luck. But within weeks, the lanes begin to empty, and within months, the dependency chains begin to snap. There are segments of the Imperium that are already accustomed to operating without the Astronomicon. The region of space beyond the Great Rift, the region the Imperium has taken to calling Nihilus, the realm of night, has been cut off from clear Astronomicon light since the formation of the Great Rift in the 41st millennium. The people and forces of Nihilus have developed workarounds, alternative navigation methods, hyper-local supply chains that minimize dependence on long warp routes. These regions will still suffer from the Emperor's death, but they will suffer differently. They are, in a dark and unintended way, better adapted to the conditions that the rest of the Imperium is about to experience for the first time. The worlds that are not adapted will begin to fragment almost immediately. Planetary governors, cut off from the orders and supply shipments they depend on, will be forced to make decisions that the Adeptus Terra would never sanction. Some will form local alliances, cooperative arrangements with neighboring systems that bypass the normal imperial administrative hierarchy. Some will declare independence. Some will simply descend into internal conflict as the various factions that imperial governance keeps in balance. The nobles, the manufacturing guilds, the local military commanders begin fighting over control of resources that are no longer being replenished from outside. Some will turn to other sources of guidance. This is the piece that the theological establishment would find most alarming if anyone were still coordinated enough to maintain a theological establishment. The moment the Astronomicon goes dark, the argument that has sustained the imperial cult for 10,000 years, that the Emperor is a living god who continues to guide and protect his people, becomes harder to make with a straight face. The God Emperor's light has literally gone out. Whatever his priests say about this, they say it in darkness. And into that darkness, other voices will speak. They always do. The chaos cults that exist on virtually every inhabited world, because the ruinous powers are patient and the human heart finds meaning in the most unexpected places, will point to the darkness and offer interpretation. Some will say it is a test. Some will say it is a punishment. Some will say it is an opportunity. They will be speaking to populations that are frightened, cold in the dark in a metaphorical and sometimes literal sense, cut off from the institutions they trusted. The recruitment rates for things the Imperium would prefer not to think about will spike in the months after the Astronomicon dies. The Imperial Guard regiments that are currently deployed across hundreds of war zones will find themselves stranded. Supply lines that depend on warp shipping will break down. Reinforcements that were en route will fail to arrive. Regiments that were holding a line with the expectation of support will realize, by degrees, that the support is not coming. The Space Marine chapters, more self-sufficient than the Guard by design, will still feel the isolation, because even Astartes need to know where the enemy is and what the priorities are, and that information travels through channels that depend on functional warp communication. Astropaths, psychers whose function is to send and receive communications through the warp, are already feeling the consequences before anyone else. The soul-binding ritual that grants astropaths their abilities ties their consciousness partially to the Emperor's psychic presence. They experience his death as a personal catastrophe, a sudden violent severance of something they have lived with for so long it feels like part of themselves. Many are driven mad in the instant of his death. Many more are driven mad in the hours following, as the warp, unregulated by the Emperor's presence in ways we will discuss shortly, begins to behave very differently than it did before. The communications network of the Imperium, already unreliable by the standards of any functional interstellar civilization, breaks down almost completely within weeks. 1,000,000 worlds, each one now silent, each one now alone. And they are alone precisely at the moment when being alone is the most dangerous thing imaginable, because the second consequence of the Emperor's death is not a slow decline. It is immediate, it is violent, and it begins within minutes of the moment his heart stops. Section 4. The Webway Breach. Terra burns. Beneath the Imperial Palace, in the chambers that sit below even the deepest sanctums of the Adeptus Custodes, there is a wound in reality. It has been there since the Horus Heresy. Magnus the Red made it when he smashed through the Emperor's psychic wards to deliver his warning. The warning that was, in a cruel irony, accurate and well-intentioned, and still managed to cause catastrophic harm through the manner of its delivery. When Magnus tore through the Webway protections, he did not simply damage an engineering project. He opened a passage between the Webway and the Warp, between the relatively safe network of subspace tunnels and the howling madness of the Immaterium. Demons flooded through. The Emperor fought them. He contained the breach, but he could not close it. He has been holding it shut for 10,000 years. The effort is constant, and it is not metaphorical. The Emperor's psychic will act as a literal barrier at the point of the breach, a containment field maintained by focused conscious intent. The moment that intent ceases, the moment the Emperor dies, the breach is no longer contained. The demons that have been pressing against that barrier from the other side for 10 millennia, building up like water behind a dam, do not wait. There is no delay, no cooling off period, no grace interval in which the custodians can respond. The breach opens, and the demons come through, and they do it in the center of Terra, within the Imperial Palace itself. What follows is the most immediate and visceral catastrophe of the Emperor's death. And in a list of catastrophes, that is a meaningful distinction. Terra is the most heavily fortified world in human history. The Imperial Palace covers a significant fraction of a continent, and it is a fortress in the most literal possible sense. Its walls, its defensive emplacements, its kill zones and gateways and redundant systems represent an investment of resources and architectural genius spanning thousands of years. The Adeptus Custodes, the personal guard of the Emperor, the most capable individual warriors in the Imperium, are stationed here in their greatest numbers, along with a permanent garrison of the Sisters of Silence, whose psychic null nature makes them extraordinarily effective against demonic incursion. None of that matters as much as it should. A demon incursion that originates inside the palace, below the walls, below the defensive perimeters, emerging directly in the inner sanctums, bypasses most of those defenses. The custodians are positioned to repel threats coming from outside. The threat comes from below. The kill zones and fortified gateways that cover every external approach are irrelevant when the enemy materializes in the corridor outside the Sanctum Imperialis. The orbital defenses and the vast Navy fleet stationed in Terra's orbital shell cannot target threats inside the palace without destroying the palace, which means they are not a factor in the initial phase of the incursion. The demons that pour through the breach are not random entities. They are the ones that have been pressed against the barrier for the longest time, the most persistent and the most powerful. The entities that chose to wait here rather than pursue other prey because they understood, in whatever way demons understand things, that the barrier would eventually fail. The Chaos Gods are not known for patience in their lesser servants, but they have long memories, and the greater powers that serve them do not think in terms of human lifespans. They have been waiting, and they have been preparing. The initial incursion takes the custodians by surprise in the most literal possible sense. There is a moment, brief and terrible, where the sentinels in the deepest chambers simply cease to exist, erased by the energy that blasts outward from the opening breach before any demon even steps through. Then the demons arrive, and the battle for the most sacred ground in the Imperium begins within minutes of the Emperor's death. The custodians fight. They always fight. They have been doing nothing else for 10,000 years, in a very real sense. Their existence as the golden guard of a dying monarch has been a long preparation for exactly this scenario, and whatever their actual emotional states, which are complex and carefully suppressed, they are the finest warriors the Imperium produces. But demons are not warriors in the conventional sense. they do not have the vulnerabilities that flesh has. Weapons that would destroy a space marine in a single hit have inconsistent effects on entities made of solidified malice. The custodians can kill them. The Sisters of Silence can suppress them, their psychic blankness acting as a form of dampening field. But the pressure is constant, and the numbers are not in the defenders' favor. And outside the palace, Terra itself begins to feel the consequences. The opening of a large warp breach in the most heavily populated place on the most populated world in the Imperium does not stay contained to the immediate area. Psychers across Terra experience the breach as a sudden screaming wrongness in their perception. Those sensitive enough have visions of what is happening beneath the palace, visions they cannot stop experiencing and cannot share coherently because astropathic communication is already failing. The ordinary population feels something less specific but no less real, a dread, a heaviness, a sense that the sky has developed something wrong about it even when it looks normal. These sensations tend, in populations that have been raised in the imperial faith, to produce either frenzied devotion or frenzied panic, and in practice the line between those two responses is thinner than most would prefer. The population of Terra is several hundred billion people. That number is important when you consider that hundreds of billions of people experiencing simultaneous panic is not an orderly or manageable phenomenon. Terra is a hive world in all but name. It is a place where human density is so extreme that the infrastructure sustaining it requires constant maintenance, and the social stability maintaining it requires constant management. Supply chains for food, water, air filtration, and basic power already rely on margins that have almost no slack. The moment the ordinary management of those systems is disrupted, and it is disrupted almost immediately as the administratum and the custodian command structure redirect every available resource toward the palace, the margins evaporate, the breach grows. This is the part that makes the defender's situation so fundamentally difficult. A warp breach that is being held back by an enormous force, the Emperor's full psychic will, directed for 10,000 years, does not simply stabilize at a new equilibrium once that force is removed. It expands. The area of warp physical interface grows as the energies on the warp side push outward, and as the local reality of Terra is increasingly saturated with warp energy, the breach becomes self-sustaining in ways that are very difficult to reverse without something equivalent to the force that originally contained it. The Emperor himself is dead. There is no equivalent force available. There are rituals. There are weapons. There is the collective might of the custodians and the Sisters of Silence, and the psychic power of the librarians that the Space Marine chapters might send in response to the unthinkable emergency. But these responses take time to marshal and deploy, and the breach is growing in real time. Every hour that passes without successful containment means a larger area of Terra is touched by the warp, more demons present inside the perimeter, more areas of the palace becoming unsafe for unprotected human presence. If no major intervention occurs within the first few days, the Imperial Palace begins to fall. And beyond the palace, beyond Terra, there is another mechanism that might activate in this window. A failsafe built into the Golden Throne itself, attributed in some accounts to the Primarch Vulcan, described in whispered terms as the Talisman of Seven Hammers. The nature of this mechanism, if it exists, is not fully disclosed in any publicly accessible record, but the concept is straightforward in its brutality. A device that would destroy Terra entirely rather than allow it to fall into the hands of chaos. The theory being that a Terra fall into chaos is far more dangerous than no Terra at all. Whether anyone has the authority, or the presence of mind, or the nerve to activate it in the chaos of the first hours after the Emperor's death. That is a question with no clean answer. The person who would make that decision no longer exists. The institution that might have made it collectively, the High Lords of Terra, will be in a state of complete collapse in the immediate aftermath. The custodians, who have the access and arguably the authority, are too busy fighting to deliberate. The talisman, if it exists, may simply wait for someone who never comes. And Terra, the cradle of humanity, burns. Section 5. The Imperium fractures. The Imperium of man has always been more fragile than it appears. From the outside, from the perspective of, say, a Tau diplomat observing the scale of it, or an Orc war boss counting the number of planets that need to be conquered before claiming it, the Imperium looks monolithic. 1 million worlds, tens of billions of soldiers, fleets of warships beyond counting, an administrative apparatus so vast that it employs a fraction of the population of every world just to handle its own paperwork. The imperial seal on a document, the imperial aquila on a uniform, the shared language of High Gothic, and the shared theology of the imperial cult, all of these suggest a unity of purpose and structure that spans the galaxy. But the Imperium has always worked in a particular way. It is not a unified political entity in any modern sense. It is better understood as a collection of semi-autonomous fiefdoms, all nominally subordinate to Terra, but practically governed by whoever holds local power. Planetary governors with hereditary claims, administratum lords with bureaucratic empires, Space Marine chapter masters with private armies and strong opinions about their independence, rogue traders with letters of marque granting them enormous latitude in the name of the Emperor. The system functions because Terra, specifically the High Lords of Terra, acting in the Emperor's name, sits above all of these factions as a final authority that none of them can individually overpower, and that all of them, at least officially, recognize. Remove Terra from the equation, and the architecture collapses. The High Lords of Terra are the governing council of the Imperium. 12 seats occupied by the heads of the major institutions, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the Fabricator General of Mars, the Ecclesiarch of the Imperial Cult, the Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum, the Chancellor of the Estate Imperialis, the Master of the Astronomicon, the Inquisitorial Representative, and others. In normal circumstances, normal being a relative term in a civilization perpetually at war, these 12 individuals between them wield authority over essentially every function the Imperium performs. Their decrees go out to every sector, every subsector, every system. They coordinate the allocation of military resources, the direction of the tithe system that supports the imperial war machine, the maintenance of the doctrinal consistency that keeps a million worlds singing from roughly the same theological hymn sheet. The moment word spreads that the Emperor is dead, and the word will spread because things like this cannot be contained regardless of how many seals and gag orders are issued, the authority of the High Lords begins to evaporate. Consider the political dynamics that follow. The High Lords rule in the Emperor's name. They have always ruled in the Emperor's name, because ruling in their own names would make explicit that the authority they exercise is not divine, but political, and political authority over a million worlds is, historically, not something any 12 people can maintain for long without the theological scaffolding that makes it seem natural and inevitable. The Emperor's divinity is not merely a comfort to the common citizenry. It is the legal and philosophical basis for the High Lord's power. Remove the Emperor, and every planetary governor, every sector lord, every powerful figure who has ever resented a tithe demand, or a draft call, or an inquisitorial investigation suddenly has a much stronger argument for reconsidering their relationship with the central authority. The Adeptus Mechanicus is the first institution to respond autonomously, and they do so not out of malice, but out of function. Mars has always been effectively independent. The Mechanicus have their own doctrine, their own chain of command, their own fleet, their own definition of loyalty that relates to the Omnicia and only tangentially to the Senatorum Imperialis. The deal struck between the Emperor and the Fabricator General at the founding of the Imperium gave Mars considerable latitude, and the Mechanicus have spent 10,000 years accumulating more of it quietly. When Terra falls into crisis, the Fabricator General on Mars is more than capable of simply not receiving orders while continuing to send out directives of their own. It is not rebellion in any dramatic sense. It is institutional inertia on a civilizational scale. The Space Marine chapters respond according to their individual characters. The Ultramarines, who by the 41st millennium have Robute Guilliman himself as their chapter master and Lord Commander of the Imperium, will likely be among the most organized and effective responders. Guilliman's project, the Indomitus Crusade, the Primaris reinforcements, the cautious reforms he has been pushing since his resurrection, has been working toward a more sustainable Imperium precisely because he understands the fragility of the current arrangement better than almost anyone. The death of the Emperor is the scenario he has been dreading since the moment he opened his eyes and found himself in a civilization that had managed 10,000 years of managed decline. His response will be immediate, coordinated, and aimed at preventing the worst-case outcomes. But the Ultramarines and their successors, substantial as they are, cannot speak for all chapters. The Space Wolves will defend Fenris and the surrounding sectors, full stop. The Dark Angels will be managing their own secrets, as they have always managed their own secrets. The Unforgiven have a private agenda that does not always align with the public good. The Blood Angels will be dealing with the Flaw, the Red Thirst, and the Black Rage, which the death of the Emperor is likely to exacerbate in ways that the Blood Angels' command staff are not going to publicize. Several chapters, whose loyalty has always been somewhat contingent on circumstances, will find circumstances sufficiently disrupted that their contingency clauses begin to feel relevant. Some chapters will declare independence. They already have the weapons, the worlds, and the organizational capability to sustain themselves as autonomous military powers. Some will be absorbed into whatever regional power structure coalesces in their area. Some will simply retreat to their fortress monasteries and wait, which is a very old response to galactic chaos that has worked out for some chapters before. The ecclesiarchy, the institution of the imperial cult, the religious body that manages the faith of hundreds of billions, faces an identity crisis more fundamental than a political one. The imperial cult is the worship of the emperor as a living god. If the emperor is dead, the living god is dead. The philosophical implications of this for a faith that has absolutely no theological tradition of coping with the death of its central deity, because the entire structure of the faith was built on the assumption that he would never die, are profound, and they will play out differently in different places. Some priests will deny it. The emperor cannot die. Whatever is being said, whatever seems to have happened, it is a lie, a trick, a test of faith. The emperor is eternal. Maintain the services. Burn more candles. Pray harder. This response is psychologically understandable and will be adopted by a large fraction of the ecclesiarchy, at least initially, because the alternative, acknowledging that the god is dead and the imperium is no longer divinely ordained, is too destabilizing to contemplate. Others will pivot. The emperor was always more than a body. He was an idea, a will, a spirit. His physical death, if it happened, if it is real, does not diminish his divine status. His spirit persists in the warp. The Astronomicon may be dark, but the Emperor's light shines in other ways. This position is theologically creative and practically useful and will eventually be adopted by the mainstream of the surviving ecclesiarchy because institutions that want to survive tend to adapt their doctrines to change circumstances. And some will do something more dangerous. Some will begin asking questions, searching for alternatives, considering, in the privacy of their own minds and then in hushed conversations with trusted colleagues, whether the Emperor's death means that a new divine authority might arise. The warp does not leave spiritual vacuums unfilled for long. The Inquisition, the institution whose entire function is to maintain the purity of the Imperium against heresy, mutation, and alien influence, will fracture along its existing fault lines almost immediately. The three major ordos have never been as unified as their shared name suggests. The inquisitorial response to the Emperor's death will involve at least one purge of other inquisitors, because inquisitors respond to crisis by looking for traitors, and in a crisis this large, the traitors are somewhere. The result is an institution that becomes less useful precisely when it is most needed, consumed by internal investigations, while the things it is supposed to investigate expand unopposed. The administratum, the vast bureaucracy that handles the actual functioning of the Imperium's internal systems, will do what bureaucracies do in a crisis. It will continue to function in those areas where it can function without external input, and it will fail completely in those areas where the functions it performs depend on inputs that are no longer arriving. Filing systems will remain immaculate. Records of tithes paid to a capital that can no longer receive them will be meticulously maintained. Requests for clarification on ambiguous directives will be sent to addresses that can no longer respond, and the relevant files will be placed in pending status for decades. The ordinary human being on an ordinary imperial world will notice this last. They will notice it in the supply chain failures, in the guard regiments that do not arrive to relieve the ones that have been fighting for 3 years and need to go home, in the prayer services that begin to diverge from the standard liturgy because the priest is adapting it based on local conditions and there is no longer any central authority to send an enforcer. In the conversations at the market, the oldest form of news distribution in human history, where people trade rumors and try to piece together a picture of what is happening from fragments, and arrive at conclusions that range from mostly accurate to wildly wrong to catastrophically misinformed. The Imperium does not end on the day the Emperor dies. It does not even obviously begin to end. It continues to function in the way that a huge machine continues to move for some time after the power is cut, through inertia, through the residual effects of previous inputs, through the dogged determination of individuals at every level who refuse to believe that the institution they have given their lives to could simply stop. But the cracks are there, and they are widening. And outside the Imperium's walls, watching these cracks form through various means of observation, the ones that feel it through the warp, the ones that process it through vast calculation, the ones that simply hear the silence where the Astronomicon used to be, the enemies of mankind are noticing. Section 6. The enemies unleashed. The galaxy is not a quiet place on any ordinary day. On any given standard date in the 41st millennium, the Imperium is fighting on somewhere between a dozen and 100 major fronts simultaneously, plus a number of minor engagements, so numerous that the Administratum stopped counting them precisely around the 36th millennium because the count was consuming computational resources that could be better used for other things. Chaos incursions, Xenos raids, planetary rebellions, Orc invasions, Tyranid splinter fleets, Necron awakening events, Dark Eldar slave raids, Tau border skirmishes. This is normal. This is the background hum of existence in a galaxy that is very old, very full, and very hostile. The death of the Emperor does not create these threats. They already exist. What it does is remove the countervailing forces that have been, with varying degrees of success, holding them back. And then it provides each faction with specific opportunities or compulsions that they would not otherwise have. Let us begin with the entity that has been waiting for this moment. In some sense, since before the Horus Heresy, the Chaos Gods are not individual beings in a way that maps cleanly onto any human category. They are vast psychic entities formed from the collective emotions and experiences of conscious beings. Khorne from rage and slaughter, Tzinchi from hope and scheming, Nurgle from despair and endurance, Slaanesh from excess and sensation. They exist in the warp, and they influence the material universe indirectly, through their demons and their mortal servants, because they cannot simply reach across the boundary between dimensions unaided. The Emperor has been, for 10,000 years, the primary reason that influence is not more direct. This requires explanation, because it is not the way the Emperor's protective function is usually described. The Emperor's presence in the warp was not merely defensive. He was not simply holding a door shut. He was also a presence of equivalent magnitude to the Chaos Gods themselves, a psychic entity of sufficient power that his existence in the Immaterium created something like a counterweight. Not a perfect balance, not a stalemate, but a weight on the scales that made certain things harder for the Chaos Gods to achieve. The opening of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the massive warp tear that split the galaxy in two, was possible partly because the Emperor's strength had been declining for millennia. A version of the Emperor at full strength, fully mobile, fully active, would probably have prevented the rift entirely. The weakened Emperor on the throne could not. When the Emperor dies entirely, that counterweight is removed. What follows in the warp is not a subtle shift. It is a restructuring. The Chaos Gods, for the first time in the age of the Imperium, have no significant psychic opposition in the Immaterium. There are other forces. The Aeldari's various psychic traditions, the nascent god Iniad, various powerful psykers and artifacts, but these are not equivalent in magnitude to the Emperor. The warp, which has been in a state of tension and partial stability for 10,000 years, becomes more turbulent, more penetrable, more easily influenced by the ruinous powers. The boundary between the warp and the material universe, always thinner in the 41st millennium than at earlier points in history, becomes thinner still. Worlds that were marginally safe from demonic incursion are suddenly below the threshold. The Chaos Space Marines are the most immediately dangerous organized force that responds to this development, because unlike the demons who can only exist in the material universe with effort and expenditure, the traitor legions are already in the material universe. They have been fighting for 10,000 years with the goal of bringing the Emperor's realm to ruin, sustained by their allegiance to powers that do not tire and do not lose interest. The Word-Bearers, the legion that above all others has devoted itself to the spread of chaos worship, have prepared for this moment with the kind of devotion that only 10,000 years of religious obsession can produce. Their preparations, carried out on hundreds of worlds throughout the Eye of Terror and beyond, are designed to be activated by exactly this event. Cults spring to life, hidden armories are opened, coordinates that have been waiting for a confirming signal receive it. The Black Legion, Horus's legion remade under the banner of Abaddon, has been the most consistent military threat to the Imperium for most of the intervening millennia. Abaddon's 13 Black Crusades have each pushed the boundaries of what the Imperium's defenses can withstand, and each has ended not because Abaddon was definitively defeated, but because the strategic objective, whatever it happened to be in that particular crusade, was achieved or the balance of advantage shifted. The 14th Crusade, which in some sense never truly ended after the opening of the Great Rift, now operates in an environment where the Imperium's ability to coordinate defense has catastrophically declined. Abaddon has spent his existence planning for contingencies that most Imperial strategists refuse to consider. He is, whatever else, exceptionally well prepared for a galaxy in which the Emperor is dead. But the Chaos forces, for all their power, are not unified. The four major Chaos gods have fundamentally incompatible agendas. Khorne wants slaughter, Tzeentch wants change and complexity, Nurgle wants entropy and submission, Slaanesh wants sensation and dissolution. And their mortal servants reflect these incompatibilities. The traitor legions fight each other nearly as often as they fight the Imperium, and in the absence of a unifying strategic objective, this tendency reasserts itself. Some of the most dangerous scenarios for the Imperium involve Chaos factions, temporarily setting aside their conflicts to concentrate on a common enemy, but temporary is the operative word. And as soon as the common enemy is no longer a useful organizing principle, the internal conflicts resume. Now, consider the orcs. Orcs are, in the broadest possible terms, a problem that does not get better. They breed faster than they die, they become individually more powerful with more combat experience, and their collective psychic field, a gestalt emanation from the mass consciousness of every orc alive, becomes stronger as their numbers increase. A big enough orc gathering creates its own reality-distorting effects. The orcs collectively believe their weapons will work, and because the warp energy generated by millions of orc minds is being directed at this belief, the weapons do work in ways that physics would otherwise not support. The Emperor's death removes the primary reason several major orc invasions have been contained, not because the Emperor directly fights orcs, but because the command structure and coordination capacity of the Imperium are what allow effective counter-invasions. Once that coordination capacity is compromised, orc invasions that were being suppressed through sustained Imperial military pressure become invasions that simply grow. The orc concept of escalating violence, the pull that draws more orcs to a fight, a momentum that builds toward larger and larger conflicts, does not require any strategic planning on the orcs' part. It simply occurs, as it always has, whenever the opposition weakens sufficiently that the momentum can build. There are, at the time of the Emperor's hypothetical death, several orc forces in the galaxy that are only being kept at their current scale through continuous Imperial military effort. Remove that effort, and those forces begin to grow. Within years, they are significantly larger. Within decades, some of them are what the orcs call a proper event, a galaxy-spanning wave of violence that consumes everything in its path. The Necrons wake. This is, perhaps counterintuitively, a more complex threat than the orcs or the Chaos forces, because the Necrons are not simply hostile to all life on instinct. They are ancient, intelligent, and motivated by goals that are their own, rather than simply consuming or destroying. The Necron dynasties have been in various states of dormancy and reawakening throughout the 41st millennium, and their relationship with the Imperium has ranged from active warfare to cautious coexistence to occasional unsettling cooperation against threats that both parties found more dangerous than each other. But the Emperor's death changes the calculation for several Necron lords in specific ways. The Necrons understand the warp, or rather they understand its absence, because their entire civilization is built on having removed themselves from psychic vulnerability, and they will assess the surge of warp energy that follows the Emperor's death with the kind of analytical precision that their mechanical minds are designed for. The conclusion they will reach is that the galaxy is about to become significantly less stable, and several of them will have strong opinions about whether that is tolerable. Some Necron lords will attempt to accelerate their awakening schedules. Others will pursue the ancient project of warp suppression, the mechanisms and technologies that the Citan and the early Necrons used to reduce the warp's influence, which if deployed at sufficient scale, would affect the Chaos Gods and the Tyranids and the psychic forces of the Aeldari as much as the forces of the Emperor. Some will opportunistically target human worlds that were previously too well defended to attack and are now exposed by the collapse of Imperial coordination. The Tyranids follow the biomass. The great hive fleets of Hive Fleet Leviathan, Behemoth, and Kraken have each struck the Imperium with varying success, and the current tactical situation involves multiple splinter fleets probing Imperium defenses at a dozen different points. The Tyranids are not strategically conscious in any individual sense. There is no admiral aboard a Tyranid hive ship, but the shadow in the warp, the psychic dampening field that hive fleets project, becomes somewhat less relevant as a threat in an environment where the warp is already more turbulent. What does become more relevant is the Tyranid directional intelligence. The Hive Mind processing signals from its shadow in the warp senses the reduction in organized psychic opposition and adjusts the vectors of approach accordingly. Worlds that were defended become worlds that are not defended. The calculus of the Hive Fleet changes. The great tide of consumption turns toward the soft center of the galaxy, where the most biomass is concentrated, and the organized resistance is least. The Aeldari, the ancient space elves, the survivors of the civilization whose fall created Slaanesh and set the galaxy on the path that led to all of this, respond according to their deeply fragmented political situation. The craft world Aeldari of Ulthwé and Baelton and the others have predicted the Emperor's death in their psychic visions for centuries. Their farseers have been preparing for it, have been gaming out the possible paths through it, have been arguing among themselves about what the optimal Aeldari response is. The Harlequins, the servants of the laughing god Segurach, have their own perspective, which involves a plan they have never fully disclosed to anyone outside the Harlequin masks. The Drukhari of Komorog see opportunity. None of them are going to save the Imperium. That is not their agenda. But some of them have interests that align, temporarily and conditionally, with preventing the absolute worst outcomes for the galaxy as a whole, because a galaxy entirely consumed by chaos, or entirely stripped of biomass by the Tyranids, is also not a galaxy in which Aeldari civilization flourishes. The galaxy, in the weeks and months after the Emperor's death, does not become more dangerous in a single direction. It becomes more dangerous in every direction simultaneously. The specific balance that 10,000 years of imperial military effort had achieved, not peace, never peace, but a kind of managed violence where each threat was roughly matched by a countervailing force, collapses. And it does not collapse into a new balance. It collapses into chaos in the literal and metaphorical sense. Every faction that has been watching and waiting, every enemy that was held back by the knowledge that the Imperium could and would respond, every force that has been building behind its own particular barrier, they all register the change. They all respond. They all move. The galaxy descends into something that already had no shortage of wars, and somehow makes it worse. Section 7. The Psychic Shockwave. There is a moment that happens before all the political fallout, before the military consequences, before the Xenos advance and the chaos surge and the supply chain collapse. A moment that lasts perhaps a fraction of a second in material time, but ripples outward through the warp in ways that take years to fully express themselves. The moment the Emperor dies. The Emperor is not just a man. He has not been just a man for most of recorded human history, and the definition of what he actually is has been debated by theologians, philosophers, and inquisitorial scholars for millennia without resolution. But whatever the precise theological or metaphysical category that describes him, the practical reality is this. He is the single most powerful psychic entity of human origin that has ever existed, and for the last 10,000 years, his psychic presence in the warp has been constant, enormous, and deeply woven into the structure of how the immaterium functions in relation to the Milky Way. When something of that magnitude ceases to exist in the warp, ceases suddenly, not through gradual diminishment, but through the complete and final ending of the consciousness that anchored it, the warp does not simply register the change and adjust. It reacts, violently. The psychic shockwave from the Emperor's death would propagate through the warp faster than any physical phenomenon because the warp does not operate by physical rules. Information in the warp does not travel at the speed of light. It travels at something closer to the speed of consequence. It arrives when it needs to, when the narrative of cause and effect demands it, which from a physical universe perspective looks approximately instantaneous at interstellar distances. Every psyker in the galaxy feels it simultaneously. What they feel depends on how they are connected to the Emperor. Astropaths feel it first and worst. The soul-binding ritual that grants astropaths their focus and their protection, a process in which the Emperor himself once participated through some extension of his awareness that he maintained even from the throne, is severed all at once. Imagine a process where your eyesight has been augmented by an external mechanism for your entire adult life. Now imagine the mechanism being yanked out without warning. The astropaths who survive the initial shock, and many do not, are left profoundly destabilized. Some are blinded to the psychic communications they previously sent and received. Some find their abilities transformed in unexpected ways. Some are overwhelmed by the raw, unfiltered warp signals they suddenly cannot block out. The entire astropathic relay network, the system of psychic communication that provides the Imperium with its equivalent of long-distance communications, goes offline simultaneously across the entire galaxy. Not gradually, not in sectors, but all of it at once. The last messages received through the network will be the panicked partial impressions of astropaths in the moment of the shock, followed by silence. That silence will be the first and clearest signal to commanders and governors across the galaxy that something has happened. Because even in warp storms, even in the worst conditions the Imperium has faced, the astropathic network has always eventually resumed. It does not resume this time. Space Marine librarians, the Psyker warriors of the Astartes chapters, experience the shockwave differently. Their psychic abilities are not soul-bound to the Emperor in the same direct way astropaths are. Their link to him is more abstract, mediated through the chapter's traditions and the genocide that connects them to the Primarchs who were themselves created by the Emperor. What they experience is not the personal devastation of severed binding, but something closer to a deep wrongness, a perception that something load-bearing in the psychic architecture of the galaxy has simply ceased to exist. Veteran librarians who have been fighting for centuries will know immediately what it means. Younger ones may not consciously understand it, but will react instinctively, their powers fluctuating in the hour of the death, warp entities pressing harder against the psychic barriers they maintain. The Grey Knights are a special case. The Grey Knights are a chapter of Space Marines who are entirely composed of psychers, whose founding and purpose is to fight demonic incursion, whose every weapon and piece of war gear is designed around psychic principles, and whose brotherhood has woven into its very founding the psychic will of the Emperor himself. They are, in a sense that goes beyond mere allegiance, an expression of the Emperor's will given form. The question of what happens to an institution that is fundamentally grounded in a presence that no longer exists is a profound one, and the Grey Knights will need to answer it in the most difficult possible circumstances, fighting the demonic incursions that are exploding across the galaxy even as they try to understand what they have lost. The Grey Knights may survive. They may survive well, because they are designed for exactly the scenarios that are about to unfold everywhere. But the metaphysical crisis at the core of their identity will not be easily resolved, and there will be members of the Brotherhood who find the Emperor's death personally destabilizing, in ways that no amount of tactical excellence can compensate for. Ordinary humans who are not psychers feel the shockwave too, though they cannot identify what they are feeling. There is a long history in the Imperium of mass premonition events, moments where populations on multiple worlds simultaneously report feelings of dread or visions of darkness that correlate with major warp events. The Emperor's death will generate the largest such event in recorded history, hundreds of billions of people across the galaxy experiencing something in the same moment, a feeling like the floor dropping away, like a deep cold settling in, like the last moment before falling, without understanding what it is or where it comes from. The more psychically sensitive among the ordinary population will have visions. Those visions will not be uniformly dark. Some will see a great light fading. Some will see a child in the void, an image that will come to carry enormous significance in the years that follow, for reasons we will discuss shortly. Some will see something that their faith tradition will interpret as the Emperor ascending, departing, transcending. And those interpretations, however inaccurate they may be in a technical sense, will become the foundation of the new religious forms that begin to develop in the wake of the death. In the warp itself, the reactions are on a scale that the material universe can only partially perceive. The Chaos Gods recognize what has happened. They have been waiting for it with varying degrees of active expectation and passive confidence. Tzeentch understood it as a probability that kept growing. Khorne recognized it as the ending of a particular kind of defiance. Nurgle greeted it with the slow equanimity he brings to all entropy, and Slaanesh felt it as a sensation of enormous complexity. Their responses are not coordinated. They are incapable of coordination because their natures are incompatible, but each of them moves to capitalize on the change in ways that reflect their respective characters. In the material universe, this manifests as an increase in the frequency and intensity of demonic incursions across every world with a significant warp presence. Places that have been havens, bastions where the boundary between the warp and real space was thick and stable, begin to feel the thinning. The warp bleeds through in small ways first, objects moving on their own, lights flickering without power fluctuations, whispered voices in empty rooms, brief and inconsistent manifestations that could be attributed to coincidence or imagination. Then, as the weeks pass and the warp's new behavior stabilizes into its post-Emperor patterns, the bleedings become more sustained, the incursions more organized, the demons more confident. The Eldar god Inead, the god of death in the Aeldari pantheon, currently in the process of being born from the accumulated souls of every Aeldari who has died since the fall, perceives the Emperor's death as a moment of enormous possibility. The Inari, the followers of Ivrain and the Vaisark who serve Inead, will interpret the event through their own particular theology. In their reading, the death of the God Emperor of mankind is not simply a disaster. It may be a catalyst, a moment powerful enough to push Inead closer to full birth, because the warp energy released by the death of the most powerful psychic being in human history does not simply dissipate. It goes somewhere. It does something. What it does, precisely, is one of the most contested questions in the speculative theology of this scenario. But there is one more consequence of the psychic shockwave that needs to be addressed before we move to the question of rebirth, and it is perhaps the most philosophically significant. What happens to the billions of people who die every day across the Imperium, their souls taking their chances in the warp? The Emperor's presence in the warp has not been, for most of the last 10,000 years, a comfort to dying souls in any direct or personal sense. He has not been reaching down and catching the dead, but his existence as a massive psychic anchor has provided a kind of gravity in the warp, a reference point of light that may, for psychers and those with psychic potential, have offered some small protection from the predators of the immaterium in the moments after death. A lighthouse does not have to specifically guide each ship. Its existence makes the sea somewhat navigable. When the lighthouse goes out, the sea becomes somewhat less navigable for everyone navigating it. The theological implications of this, the fact that the protection the imperial cult claims the God Emperor offers to the dead may have just become significantly less effective, will not be processed by most people for a very long time. Many people will never know it has happened. But for the inquisitors and the librarians, and the seers who understand the warp well enough to perceive it, the change will register with the force of a revelation. Everything that was protected by the Emperor's existence is now somewhat less protected. Everything that was held back by his presence is somewhat less held back. The shockwave passes through the galaxy and leaves nothing entirely unchanged. And in the warp, at the heart of all that turbulence, something very small and very old and very quiet begins to move. Section 8. Could he return? The Starchild Theory. This is the question that defines the difference between a story about an ending and a story about a transformation. Because the Emperor dying, really, truly, finally dying, may not be the end of the Emperor. Let that sit for a moment. There is a body of lore in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, some of it canonical, and some of it hovering in the gray zone between confirmed lore and speculative tradition. That suggests the Emperor's death is not the conclusion of his story. It may be the beginning of a new chapter of it. The relevant concept is usually called the Starchild Theory, and understanding it requires understanding something about how the most powerful psychic entities in the setting actually work. Psykers generate psychic energy that exists in both the material universe and the warp simultaneously. When a psyker dies, their soul, which is to say their psychic presence, the warp side expression of their consciousness, does not simply disappear. It dissipates into the immaterium, becoming part of the general background of psychic energy that the chaos gods and their demons swim through. For most psykers, this means being consumed. The predators of the warp take the soul and absorb its energy, and that is the end of the individual. For exceptionally powerful psykers, the process is more complex. The soul is too large to simply dissipate or be immediately consumed. It lingers. It can, in some circumstances, reform. The Emperor is not a merely powerful psyker. He is the product of the simultaneous death of approximately 1,000 shamans who chose to sacrifice themselves so that their combined psychic power could be reborn as a single entity. That event is estimated to have occurred around 50,000 years ago. The Emperor is not, in the strictest sense, a natural being. He is a designed consciousness of enormous power, and his relationship to death has never followed the normal rules. He is what the lore calls a perpetual, a being who in his earlier existence simply did not stay dead, repeatedly returning to life because his psychic presence was too large and too anchored to simply end. He cannot return from the death of his current state in the usual perpetual manner, because the damage done to him by Horus was not merely physical. His soul was fractured. His capacity for the kind of self-reconstitution that perpetuals perform was compromised in the same moment that his body was destroyed. The Golden Throne has kept the remnant alive, but it has not repaired the damage. There is not enough left of the original psychic structure for simple perpetual regeneration to work. But there is the Star Child. The Star Child concept appears in several different forms across the lore, and the specifics vary depending on which sources you consult. The most recent and most authoritative version comes from The End in the Death, the novel that covers the final days of the Siege of Terra, in which there is a moment, the moment of the Emperor's confrontation with Horus, the moment of the final psychic battle that ends the heresy, where the Emperor does something extraordinary. In the process of the battle, the Emperor deliberately casts something away from himself, a fragment of his psychic self, a piece of his soul detached and sent into the warp, described as a child star, a small light drifting in the darkness. This was not accidental. The Emperor, in the moment of his greatest crisis and greatest sacrifice, planned for what came after. That fragment has been in the warp for 10,000 years. It is small. It is not the Emperor. It is a piece of him, a portion of his psychic essence that survived the devastation of the rest of it by being separated from it. It has not been sitting idle. The warp changes things. Psychic energy in the warp grows, or it is consumed, depending on the nature of what it encounters and what it does. The Star Child, whatever it is, whatever it has become after 10 millennia of existence as a point of human psychic light in a sea of chaos, is potentially something more than it was when it was cast off. The question is whether it is recoverable, whether it can be amplified or drawn out, or given a vessel to inhabit, whether the fragment can become a new emperor, or something that performs the emperor's essential functions, without the limitation of a physical body that has been slowly dying for 10,000 years. There are theoretical mechanisms for this. The Aeldari god Ennead is the closest parallel in the setting. Ennead is a god being born from the accumulated psychic energy of the Aeldari dead, a deity whose existence is composed of countless smaller souls combining into something of divine magnitude. The Aeldari deliberately accelerated this process in their own mythology, and the Inari in the 41st millennium are working towards something they believe will be the completion of Ennead's birth. The principle, many souls combining into one transcendent entity, is not without precedent. The question for the Emperor is slightly different. It is not accumulation, but reconstitution. The Star Child is a seed, not a collection. For it to become something capable of what the Emperor did, it would need either to grow enormously through its own processes in the warp, or to be given a vessel that amplifies it, or to be combined with other psychic energies in a way that brings it close enough to the original whole to function. There is a theory, labeled as speculation in most scholarly treatments and as heresy in official imperial doctrine, that the correct response to the Emperor's death is not mourning, but action, that the Imperium should not be trying to keep the Emperor alive in his current state, but should have been preparing for decades to facilitate his rebirth. That the billion-strong population of psychers currently being consumed by the black ships to feed the dying throne could have been directed instead toward providing the psychic raw material for the Emperor's reconstitution. That what the 41st millennium needs is not a dying god kept barely alive by a failing machine, but a reborn one, fully realized, conscious, and active, and capable of confronting the threats of the age directly. This theory has proponents. In the lore, it has been advocated by certain figures at high levels of the Imperium who understood enough of the underlying metaphysics to see the alternative. It has been suppressed, partly because the Adeptus Mechanicus considers it dangerously heterodox, partly because the ecclesiarchy considers the suggestion that the emperor should die in order to be reborn theologically destabilizing, to say the least, and partly because no one has ever been able to demonstrate that it would work. The fear is that if you allow the emperor to die fully, intending to trigger a rebirth, and the rebirth does not occur, you have destroyed the last safeguard for nothing. It is a terrible gamble, the largest gamble in human history, and no one has been willing to take it deliberately. But if the emperor dies through the failure of the Golden Throne, the gamble occurs whether anyone chooses it or not. The question then becomes not whether the process begins, but whether anyone alive knows enough to help it along. There are hints in the lore that certain individuals and groups do know enough. Eldrad Ulthron, the Aeldari Farseer of Craftworld Ulthwé, has been aware of the Starchild's existence and its potential for longer than most human civilizations have existed. The Aeldari Seers have been threading paths through possible futures for millennia, trying to find the specific sequence of events that leads to a version of the 41st millennium that they and humanity both survive. The existence of the Starchild, a potential new human god, born from the Emperor's soul, is relevant to their calculations, because a new Emperor who is active and mobile and psychically effective would dramatically change the equation for every faction in the galaxy. The Harlequins of Segarak know things they have not told anyone else, as they always do. Their masks have been performing certain ritual plays for centuries that, to those who know what to look for, describe the process of the Emperor's death and rebirth in allegorical terms. The Laughing God has a long view and a complicated agenda and does not care about the convenience of the audience for his performances. And there are Space Marines, individual brothers from various chapters, seers from the librarius of multiple organizations, and certain figures within the Inquisition, who have encountered evidence of the Starchild's existence and have been quietly building a picture of what it means. These individuals are scattered, uncoordinated, working with fragments rather than a complete picture. But the fragments exist, and if the right people could compare notes in the right circumstances, the outline of a possible path forward would become visible. This brings us to one of the most hopeful possibilities in an otherwise deeply bleak scenario. The Emperor's death, rather than being simply a disaster, could be the trigger for a transformation, a death and rebirth cycle that produces not a dying god on a failing throne, but something new. Something that has had 10,000 years of the warp's strange alchemy to become more than what it was when it was cast off. The galaxy in the 41st millennium has a concept for this. The Chaos Gods are born from psychic energy. Inaad is being born from psychic energy. The Emperor himself was born from the pooled sacrifice of 1,000 ancient souls. The setting has established that gods can be made, that consciousness at sufficient psychic magnitude can become something that transcends the limitations of individual mortality. The Starchild, given the right circumstances, a galaxy-wide surge of psychic energy, a confluence of willing sacrifice, a vessel or a moment or a miracle of the kind the setting has a long tradition of producing at critical junctures, could be what follows the Emperor's death, not a continuation, a new beginning. The difficulty is that new beginnings of this kind have no guarantee of success, no owner's manual, no precedent. You can follow step by step. They require exactly the kind of desperate, costly, uncertain action that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to make unnecessary. They require admitting that what you have cannot be saved and trusting that what replaces it will be something you want. That is a very human kind of courage. The kind the Emperor himself demonstrated when he walked up the boarding ramp toward Horus's flagship, knowing exactly what was waiting for him. Whether anyone in the 41st millennium has the same quality of courage And whether the Star Child is still there to receive it, those are the questions that the lore asks without answering definitively, because this is exactly the kind of question that good storytelling leaves open. Section 9. 3 possible endings. The death of the Emperor does not have one outcome. It has a spectrum of them, ranging from managed catastrophe to total annihilation to something stranger and harder to categorize than either. Let us walk through 3 scenarios in detail, not as predictions, but as the honest exploration of what the lore makes possible. The first scenario, the Long Night. This is the most probable outcome given the current trajectory of events. If no extraordinary intervention occurs and no miraculous reconstitution takes place, the Emperor dies. The Astronomicon fails. Terra falls to the demonic incursion within weeks. The psychic shockwave destabilizes the astropathic network permanently. The Imperium begins to fracture along the fault lines that have been developing for centuries. The administrative lines between sectors that have never communicated well, the cultural lines between distant worlds that share little beyond the imperial Aquila and a shared language that they pronounce differently. The military lines between regions that have been fighting their own regional wars and resenting the tithe demands of a distant capital they have never seen. Within a generation, the Imperium as a unified political entity ceases to exist. It does not end dramatically with a final battle or a signing of papers. It simply stops functioning. The communications stop coming, the supply shipments stop arriving, the administratum forms stop being required because the administratum that designed them has disbanded. Local governors stop sending tithes because there is no one to receive them. They stop receiving orders because there is no one to issue them. What remains is a collection of separate civilizations in varying states of distress, each dealing with the consequences of the breakdown according to their own resources and leadership. Many of these successor states will survive. The Imperium at its peak covered roughly half the Milky Way galaxy and contained a human population in the hundreds of trillions. Many of those hundreds of trillions of people live on worlds that are reasonably self-sufficient, that have functional local governance, that have their own military capacity and their own agricultural base. They will lose the long-range trade goods, the exotic materials, the reinforcements from other sectors. They will lose the psychic communication network and the warp navigation guidance. They will be smaller, more isolated, and more vulnerable to local threats, but they will not simply cease to exist. What rises in the absence of a unified Imperium will be diverse. Successor empires, built around fortress worlds or forge worlds or powerful space marine chapters, will absorb surrounding systems into new political structures. Some of these structures will resemble the Imperium in their authoritarian character and their faith-based legitimacy. Others will look quite different, more democratic, or more openly oligarchic, or more explicitly military in their governance. The Chaos Gods thrive in this environment. They do not need a unified enemy to be satisfied. A galaxy of smaller, weaker, more isolated human civilizations is in many ways more useful to them than a single enormous empire that can field organized resistance. The individual human soul is the currency the warp trades in, and smaller civilizations are easier to corrupt, easier to introduce cults into, easier to fragment further until the worship of chaos becomes normalized on worlds that once burned heretics in the Emperor's name. This scenario is bleak. It is a long, slow, grinding diminishment of humanity's presence in the galaxy, not an extinction event. Humans are not going extinct in any short or medium term, but an ending of the civilization that the Emperor spent 45,000 years building and 10,000 years sustaining through sheer force of will. The work is not merely undone. It is rendered retroactively futile, the entire project exposed as an expenditure of unimaginable resources and human suffering that produced in the end something that lasted about as long as a minor empire by the historical standards of a galaxy that measures time in millions of years. And in the long night, the other species press their advantages. The Necrons consolidate their dynasties into larger power blocks than they have maintained since before their long sleep. The Tau, small and young by galactic standards but growing, expand aggressively into the vacuum left by withdrawing Imperial forces. The Orcs, freed from sustained Imperial military pressure, begin building towards something larger. The galaxy rearranges itself around a new equilibrium that contains significantly less humanity than the previous one. This scenario takes centuries to fully play out. The people living in its early decades will not see the worst of it, but the people living in its later centuries will inhabit a galaxy that is unrecognizable from the one described in the 41st millennium grimdark tradition. The second scenario, the apotheosis. This scenario requires the right people to take the right actions in the narrow window between the Emperor's death and the permanent collapse of the systems his existence sustained. It requires someone, or a coalition of someones, who understands the Star Child theory, who has access to the psychic resources needed to amplify and draw out the fragment of the Emperor's soul that has been drifting in the warp for 10 millennia, and who is willing to pay the price that such an operation would demand. Because it would demand a price. The warp does not give things for free, and bringing a god into the world is not a small request. The mechanics of the apotheosis scenario have never been laid out explicitly in the lore. What exists are fragments and implications. Eldrad Ulthron's long game, the Harlequin masks, and their cryptic performances, the Inari's interest in the Star Child concept, the theological tradition within certain radical inquisitorial factions, that something like this is theoretically possible. From these fragments, a rough outline can be constructed. The operation would require a massive concentration of psychic power, not the 100,000 psychers fed daily into the dying throne, but perhaps the combined psychic sacrifice of every trained psyker the Imperium can gather. It would require the death of the Emperor in a controlled and purposeful manner rather than an accidental one, the full release of whatever remains of his consciousness, letting it flow out into the warp rather than clinging to the material vessel past the point where the vessel can support it. It would require the Star Child to have survived and grown, which is not guaranteed, and it would require a way to call it back from wherever in the warp it currently exists. It would require the brief but complete cooperation of factions that are not in the habit of cooperating: the Saeldari, the Inari, the Radical Inquisitors, the Psyker families and institutions of the Imperium. And it would require doing all of this in the middle of a demonic incursion on Terra, with chaos forces pressing in from every direction, with the chaos gods themselves actively trying to prevent it. Because a fully reborn Emperor is the one thing they have more reason to fear than any other. If it worked, if the Star Child was drawn out and amplified and given form, if the psychic sacrifice was sufficient, and the chaos interference was repelled long enough for the process to complete, the result would be something new. Not the Emperor, as he was during the Great Crusade, that physically vital general god who walked battlefields and forged alliances in person. Not the Emperor on the throne, the dying psychic anchor of a failing civilization. Something that had 10,000 years of the warp's strange development behind it, shaped by what the Immaterium makes of a piece of enormous human psychic essence given time and solitude, and the pressure of chaos pressing against it from all sides. What emerges might be a new god in the truest sense, not a god of the material universe, not a god who sits in a chair and holds a breach shut, but a presence in the warp capable of directly opposing the chaos gods in their own domain. A fifth power, equal in magnitude, but opposed in nature. A human warp entity, born from human sacrifice and human hope, that does what the warp has always needed. A counterforce to the pure appetite of the ruinous powers. The Astronomicon would not return in its original form. That form required a physical body directing psychic energy from a specific point. But the new Emperor, or the new entity, whatever it should be called, might provide something different, something native to the warp, rather than projected into it. A light that guides not by being a lighthouse on a shore, but by being a property of the sea itself. This scenario is the hopeful one. It is the one where the 41st millennium's grim darkness finds a path that is not merely less dark, but genuinely illuminated. It is also the hardest to believe in, because it requires things that the setting's institutional inertia makes almost impossible. The willingness to try something new, the courage to let go of the known and trust the unknown, the capacity for cooperation across faction lines that have been hardened by 10,000 years of separate agendas. But the lore has always left this door open. The Star Child exists. The theory is there. The individuals who understand it are present in the setting. Whether anyone can open the door at the right moment is the question that the story keeps circling without answering. The third scenario, the Emperor Ascendant. This is the one that the current lore seems to be gesturing toward most specifically, and it is distinct from the apotheosis in important ways. The third scenario does not require anyone to take deliberate action. It does not require a coalition or a sacrifice ritual or the recovery of the Star Child. It requires only the Golden Throne to fail, the Emperor's physical existence to end, and the release of his soul into the warp to trigger a process that has been developing for 10,000 years without anyone managing it. The Emperor has been feeding the warp with his psychic energy since the moment he was placed on the throne. Every day, the 1,000 psychers consumed by the black ships, their power directed through the Emperor's failing mind, contributes to a pool of psychic energy that is theoretically astronomical in magnitude over 10 millennia. The Emperor himself is a being of extraordinary psychic potential who has been slowly burning in the warp, not dying, but not living, something stranger than either. 10,000 years of that state has effects that no one can accurately predict, because no one has ever existed in that state before. When the throne finally fails and the Emperor's consciousness is released from the material anchor that has been holding it in a degraded state, it enters the warp as something that is not quite a soul and not quite a god, but is moving toward the latter at a speed that the accumulated energy of 10,000 years of burning psychers and the Emperor's own unimaginable potential makes possible. The Star Child, if it is out there, acts as a seed around which this released energy might crystallize. The sacrifice of 10,000 years, finally, becomes the fuel for a transformation. In this scenario, the Emperor does not come back as a man. He does not step off the throne in a rebuilt body and walk the halls of the palace. He becomes, instead, a presence in the warp, not a chaos god, because his nature is fundamentally human and fundamentally oriented towards something other than consumption, but a being of equivalent power and very different character. The galaxy's psychic landscape shifts. The Astronomicon does not come back, but something else does. A different kind of guidance, a different kind of protection, native to the warp, in a way the beacon never was. The demonic incursion on Terra is repelled by the wave of psychic energy released in the moment of the Emperor's transformation, a shockwave of human psychic power that is the mirror image of the chaos surge that preceded it. Terra survives, though changed beyond recognition. The palace, much of it destroyed in the incursion, becomes something more like a shrine than a fortress. The new presence in the warp cannot replace the Astronomicon directly, but it can do something the Astronomicon never could. It can actively fight the chaos gods in their own domain. The balance in the warp shifts, not dramatically, not immediately, but perceptibly. The quality of the warp changes, the texture of it, in ways that psychers throughout the galaxy begin to register over the months and years that follow. The presence of something that is not chaos, something that is actively opposed to the ruinous powers and capable of contesting them, alters the fundamental dynamics of the setting. The Imperium that remains, smaller, more fragmented, stripped of its central authority but retaining its essential spirit in the hearts of its surviving populations, has something to rally around that is not the failing institution of the old Imperium, but the genuine presence of something divine that has, at extraordinary cost, become real. This scenario still involves enormous suffering. The transition period, the gap between the Emperor's death and the stabilization of whatever follows, involves exactly the disasters described in earlier sections. Worlds fall, millions die, the supply chains break, and civilizations that were marginal collapse. The survivors come through smaller, harder, more uncertain of everything they once believed, but still alive. And in the warp, for the first time since before the Horus Heresy, there is a light that is not the flickering of a dying machine, but the genuine radiance of something that has finished being born. Section 10. What the lore actually hints at. It would be dishonest to discuss all of the above without being clear about what is confirmed lore, what is strong implication, and what is fan theorizing built on hints. The lore around the Emperor's potential death and rebirth has a history, and understanding that history makes the current state of it more interesting rather than less. The Star Child concept has been part of Warhammer 40,000 since the early editions of the game. In the realm of Chaos books from the late 1980s and early 1990s, foundational lore documents that are still referenced today even though the setting has changed considerably since then, the Star Child was described explicitly. In those early texts, the concept was presented as a nascent psychic entity that the Emperor had deliberately separated from himself, a fragment of his soul that was slowly becoming something new and powerful in the warp. The implication in those early documents was clear. This entity, when it fully matured, would be capable of defending humanity in the warp in ways the Emperor on the throne could not. That concept was soft-pedaled for decades. The game's lore went in other directions, focusing on the institutional Imperium, on the Horus heresy, on the development of individual factions and their interactions. The Star Child became a footnote, referenced occasionally in pieces that emphasize speculation and fan engagement rather than in core canonical documents. Many players forgot it existed. Many who encountered it assumed it had been retconned out of existence. Then came The End and the Death. Dan Abnett's novel, the concluding volume of the Siege of Terra series, is as close to a definitive account of the Horus Heresy's final days as the setting has produced. In its pages, the Emperor's internal experience during his confrontation with Horus is described in more detail than any previous source. The moment of sacrifice, what the Emperor actually did and why, is given more context than it has ever had. And in that context, the Star Child concept was not just acknowledged but effectively confirmed. The Emperor, in the moment of his greatest extremity, was not simply fighting Horus. He was making a choice, a deliberate shaping of what would follow from his sacrifice. The fragment he cast off into the warp was intentional. It was a plan. The current lore, as of the most recent canon, has Roboute Guilliman as Lord Commander of the Imperium. Guilliman was resurrected in 41st Millennium canonical events. The Ultramarines Primarch was brought back by Aeldari intervention, specifically by Eldrad Ulthrun and the Inari. The fact that Guilliman is alive and active in the current setting is significant. He is not the Emperor and cannot replace the Emperor, but he is the closest thing to a galactic leadership figure that the Imperium currently has who is both capable and aware of the setting's true complexity. Guilliman knows the Golden Throne is failing. He has been told. He has read the Mechanicus reports. He has gone into the presence of the throne and emerged shaken in ways that his equanimity struggles to fully conceal. He knows that the current state of the Imperium is not sustainable. His political reforms, the slow, contested work of trying to make the Imperium function more rationally, are partly a response to this knowledge. He is trying to build something that will survive what he knows is coming, but he is also constrained by the very institutions he is trying to reform. The Ecclesiarchy resists any suggestion that the Emperor's physical survival is uncertain because their theological credibility depends on his immortality. The Adeptus Mechanicus resists conclusions that imply their inability to maintain the throne. The Inquisition resists the kind of open discussion that Guilliman's approach would require because open discussion is, by inquisitorial definition, a security risk. He is moving against the current of 10,000 years of institutional inertia, and he is moving faster than he would like because the clock on the Golden Throne is running down. The current lore also has the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, as a permanent feature of the galactic map. The Rift, opened during the events leading up to and following the Gathering Storm, is a massive warp tear that splits the galaxy effectively in two. Roboute Guilliman has described it as what happens when the Emperor starts to fail. Not the Emperor dying, but the Emperor weakening. The reduced psychic anchor allowing the warp to push through in ways it previously couldn't. The Rift is a preview, a demonstration of what a galaxy without the Emperor's full strength looks like on a regional scale. A galaxy without his strength at all looks like the Rift everywhere. This is not speculation. This is the logical extension of lore that has been stated explicitly. The most current Space Marine codexes and campaign books contain hints about a phenomenon the lore calls the Pariah Nexus, the psychic awakening, and the changes being observed in the behavior of the warp. Each of these suggests that the 41st Millennium, M41 in the setting's notation, is a period of genuine transition, not merely another cycle of managed crisis. Something is changing at the fundamental level of how the setting works. The events of the Gathering Storm, the resurrection of Guilliman, the emergence of Iniad, the actions of the Inari, the expanded Necron presence, all of these are the setting's way of signaling that the stable grimdark equilibrium is ending and something new is coming. What is coming has not been stated definitively. Games Workshop does not tend to close narrative doors permanently because closed doors cannot be reopened for future story content. But the direction of the hints is coherent. The Emperor's current state is terminal. Something has been building in the warp for 10,000 years, and the entity that results from what happens when the throne finally stops may be very different from the entity that was placed on it 10 millennia ago. There is also the matter of the Primarchs. Guilliman is back. Magnus the Red has been active in the setting since the Gathering Storm, serving Tzeentch but maintaining his own agenda. Mortarion leads the Death Guard. Angron has returned as a demon prince. Fulgrim serves Slaanesh. Several other Primarchs have been confirmed or strongly implied to be alive in various forms. The gathering of Primarchs, even scattered across the alignment divide between loyal and traitor, suggests that the setting is building towards something involving them. A final reckoning, a convergence of the figures who were present at the beginning, returning for the end. The Lion, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, was confirmed alive and awakened in recent lore, emerging from his long sleep in the rock to find a galaxy he barely recognizes. He is perhaps the clearest signal that Games Workshop is setting pieces for something. The Lion does not wake up for nothing. His return, his awareness of the current situation, his particular combination of ruthless pragmatism and complicated loyalty, these are not assets you put on the board if you are not planning to use them. And Sanguinius is dead. There is no coming back for the Angel. But the Blood Angels, his sons, carry his psychic imprint in their genocide, and the Flaw, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, is a direct consequence of the manner of his death at Horus's hands. The fate of the Blood Angels in any scenario involving the Emperor's death and potential rebirth is one of the setting's more poignant open questions, because the Angel's sacrifice was arguably as significant as the Emperor's own, and the fate of his legacy is unresolved in ways that feel intentional. The lore hints. It always hints. It rarely concludes. That is partly because the setting needs to remain in a state where games can be set, and armies can be fielded, and new stories can be told, and conclusive endings foreclose those possibilities. But the hints are there, and they point consistently toward a transformation rather than a simple ending. The Emperor's death is not the last page. It is the last page of a chapter that has been 10,000 years in the writing. The next chapter will be written in whatever form the setting's story takes when the people managing it decide to turn that page. And while we wait for that turning, we can sit with the question in all its darkness and complexity, and recognize that this is one of the things that makes this setting worth caring about. Not despite its grimness, but because of what that grimness frames: the stubborn human refusal to surrender, the possibility of transformation even in the darkest circumstances, and the very old idea that sometimes the only way forward is through the door that looks most like an ending. Section 11. Closing Reflection: The Weight of an Ending. We have spent the entirety of this video sitting with a question that the Warhammer 40,000 setting asks constantly in 1,000 different ways across 1,000,000 different stories. What does it cost to sustain something? The Emperor's story is, at its core, a story about that question taken to an extreme that no other fictional setting has quite managed to explore. He is a being of 10,000-year imprisonment who has given everything: mobility, communication, the ability to act, the ability to die, in service of a civilization that was supposed to be temporary scaffolding for a better future, and instead became a permanent monument to the gap between what was intended and what was achieved. The Imperium of Man is simultaneously the greatest human accomplishment in the setting's history and a colossal failure of imagination, a civilization that fossilized around the memory of its founder while he was still alive to see it happen and too broken to intervene. The cruelty of his situation is not incidental to the setting's appeal. It is central to it. In most heroic mythologies, the great sacrifice is followed by the reward. The hero gives everything, and the world is saved, and the people flourish, and the darkness is genuinely, durably defeated. The Emperor's sacrifice in the Horus heresy saved the Imperium from chaos at that moment, and the price was 10,000 years on a machine that was never designed for the purpose it was pressed into, holding the line alone, while the civilization he built slowly became everything he had spent 45,000 years trying to prevent. He is the God whose name is spoken in 1 billion prayers every day, in a civilization that would horrify him. He is the liberator, whose legacy is a theocracy he never intended. He is the greatest psyker in human history, confined to a room underground, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything except exist. That is not a triumphant story, but it is an honest one. In the darkest possible way, about the relationship between sacrifice and outcome. The intention does not always match the result. The greatest effort does not always produce the best ending, and sometimes the structures we build to honor a sacrifice end up betraying the spirit of it more thoroughly than any enemy could. The question of what happens when the Emperor dies is really two questions layered on top of each other. The first question is the practical one. What does the Imperium look like when its central support is removed? What falls? What burns? What survives? We have explored that question at length. The answer is harsh and specific, and does not offer comfortable reassurance. Things fall, things burn, some things survive. The second question is the one the Star Child theory pushes us toward. Can a sacrifice on this scale produce something more than the maintenance of a declining status quo? Can 10,000 years of one being's suffering and constrained existence become the fuel for an actual transformation? Can the Emperor's death, terrible and catastrophic as it will be in its immediate consequences, ultimately be the price of something worth the cost? The lore does not answer that question. It holds it open, deliberately, with the skill of a storyteller who knows that some doors are more interesting open than closed. The door is there. The door is beautiful in a bleak and challenging way. What is behind it is not yet known. What we do know is this. The setting has spent more than 3 decades building toward a moment that everyone who plays it or reads it understands is coming. The throne is failing. The Emperor is dying. The forces arrayed against humanity have never been stronger or more coordinated. The institutions that have managed the Imperium's survival have never been more strained. And in the warp, for a very long time now, something small and bright has been drifting, growing slowly in the darkness, shaped by the strangest 10,000 years any fragment of a consciousness has ever endured. Warhammer 40,000 is not an optimistic setting. It has never pretended to be. Its tagline is a direct statement of bleakness. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And yet the setting keeps producing characters who refuse to accept that bleakness as the final word. The Salamanders, who care about the people they protect. The Lamenters, who suffer constantly and keep going anyway. Caiaphas Cain and his private terror behind the public heroism. Gaunt and his ghosts and the ghost of Tanith. The individuals scattered through the Imperium who maintain their humanity against every institutional incentive to surrender it. The ones who remember that the billions of people they are fighting for are not statistics but persons. The Emperor made himself into a machine to save them. The question of whether he can come back from that, whether what drifts in the warp still contains something recognizably human, something that remembers why it made the sacrifice rather than just the fact of it, is the most profound question the setting has ever built itself around. And when the throne finally fails, when the answer begins to emerge, when the story turns the page that has been waiting to be turned for 10,000 years of insetting time and 30-plus years of real-world storytelling, that is going to be one of the most significant moments in the history of this hobby. Whether it comes in a novel, a campaign book, a new edition of the rules, or something that has not yet been invented. When it comes, it will have been building toward this for longer than most of us have been alive. The Emperor endures, on the throne and perhaps beyond it, in the faith of billions who have never had a reason to doubt him, and in the quiet calculations of the few who understand exactly why they should. In the setting that bears his civilization's name, even in the moments when that civilization seems most likely to fall, and somewhere in the warp, in the spaces between the howling of chaos gods and the silence of the dead, a child star continues its drift, waiting, growing, the smallest possible fire against the largest possible darkness, waiting for the moment when the door finally opens. If you have made it to the end of this one, I want to say genuinely, thank you. These deep dives take a long time to put together, and reaching the end with me means a lot. If this video gave you something to think about or something to feel, the best thing you can do is leave a comment below with your thoughts. What scenario do you think is most likely? Do you believe the Star Child theory? Do you think the apotheosis would save the Imperium or just create a different kind of chaos? I want to read everything you have to say about this. And if you are not subscribed yet, this channel exists to explore exactly these kinds of questions. The deep lore, the philosophical weight, the implications that the setting gestures toward without spelling out. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Until then, stay in the light, whatever light remains. Expanded. the human cost. Across a dying galaxy, the numbers the Imperium deals in are so large that they stop feeling real within a few sentences. 1,000,000 worlds, hundreds of trillions of citizens, billions of soldiers, thousands of ships. The scale is designed to communicate overwhelming scope, and it succeeds so well that the individual human beings inside those numbers can become invisible. So, let us slow down and think about the Emperor's death, not in terms of strategic consequences, but in terms of what it feels like from the inside, for specific people, in specific places, as the collapse unfolds around them. Consider a guardsman on a world called something like Cavrith 4, a hive world with a population in the low billions, defending the planet's northern manufactorum district against an ongoing orc incursion that has been grinding on for 6 years. He has been fighting for 4 of those 6 years. He knows the terrain better than he knew his home city before the war. He knows which corridors the Greenskins prefer to advance through, which elevated positions the heavy bolter teams can hold longest, how long a full ration pack lasts when you are stretching it, because the supply shipment was 3 weeks late again. His unit has been told that relief is coming, that a full regiment of Catacon veterans has been assigned to their sector and is in transit somewhere between here and the transport hub at Vesteris Prime. This information came through astropathic relay 6 weeks ago, slightly garbled as it always is, but the general meaning was clear. Help is coming. Hold on. The day the Emperor dies, this guardsman does not know it. No one on Cavrith 4 knows it. They are 1,400 light-years from Terra. The news, in a normal functional Imperium, would reach them via astropathic relay in a matter of weeks. In the immediate aftermath of the Emperor's death, with the astropathic network failing, the relay stations going dark one by one, as the soul-bound astropaths at their centers are destroyed or driven mad by the severance. The news does not arrive in weeks. It arrives as silence. The Catacon regiment does not come. The transport that was carrying it made a navigational error in the warp on the day the Astronomicon failed, and it is now somewhere very different from where it intended to be, slowly running out of supplies and transmitting distress signals that no one can hear. The guardsman does not know this either. What he knows is that the supply shipment is now 7 weeks late instead of 3, and the commander cannot raise anyone at the sector relay station, and the local commissar has begun leading prayer services that are longer and more intense than usual, which everyone knows is a bad sign. The orcs advance. They are not strategically aware of what has happened to the Imperium. They simply notice, with the blunt collective intelligence of their kind, that the defense is softer than it was, that the heavy bolter positions are running low on ammunition, that the Valkyrie gunships have stopped flying because the fuel depots are empty and the resupply that would have refilled them is not coming. That resistance in Sector 7 has collapsed entirely after the platoon defending it ran out of food and broke down into inter-squad conflict over the remaining rations. The orcs advance because the defense is weakening. The defense is weakening because the Emperor died 1,400 light-years away, and the chain of consequences runs through navigation failures and communication blackouts and supply chain collapses all the way down to this one guardsman in this one corridor, with 6 rounds left in his laser gun and no way to call for support. This is the texture of the catastrophe, not the grand strategic movements, not the fall of civilizations viewed from orbit. The 6 rounds in the laser gun, and the silence on the Vox, and the knowledge that whatever was coming to help is not coming anymore. Now multiply that guardsman by the billions. There are, on any given day in the 41st millennium, perhaps 40 million separate guard engagements, ranging from minor patrol contacts to full-scale planetary assaults. The majority of them rely on the logistical infrastructure of the Imperium, supply chains, communication networks, navigable warp routes for reinforcement and extraction. When those systems fail, each of those 40 million engagements begins to degrade at its own rate, according to its own specific dependencies, and the degradation does not stop at the tactical level. It moves through the chain. The unit commander who loses contact with sector command stops receiving orders. Without orders, she relies on judgment and local intelligence. Her judgment is good. She has been fighting for 15 years and earned her commission, but without intelligence from the broader theater of operations, that judgment is working with an increasingly incomplete picture. She makes good decisions based on the information she has. The information she has is wrong in specific ways she cannot know about, because the information that would correct it stopped arriving. The The planetary governor 3 systems over has better communication than the guardsman. He has a personal astropath, a senior one who was not soulbound in the standard fashion and has survived the shockwave of the Emperor's death, though barely. Through this astropath, he receives fragments of information that suggest something very large has gone wrong, that the central authorities are not available, that nearby worlds have gone silent, that a chaos cult that has been contained for 30 years on the industrial continent has somehow grown to a size that the local Arbites cannot handle alone, and the PDF regiments that should be suppressing it have been ordered to stand down by someone claiming to have imperial authority that the governor cannot verify. He makes decisions. He tries to act. He contacts his neighboring governors through the astropath, tries to build a local network, tries to coordinate. 2 of them respond. 3 do not. One of the ones that responds is cooperative. The other is already planning to absorb his world's trade network into its own sphere of influence now that the central authority is no longer available to stop it. The galaxy is full of people like this governor, trying to manage the unmanageable with the information they have, making good faith decisions in bad faith circumstances, holding together whatever piece of the structure they can reach, while the rest of it collapses beyond their range. Some of them will succeed. In the wreckage of the Imperium, many competent and dedicated individuals will build something, smaller, more local, more honest about what it is and what it can do than the institution that preceded it. The seeds of successor civilizations are in these people, in their networks and their relationships, and their ability to adapt to circumstances they were never trained for. The question is whether those seeds get enough time and stability to germinate before the next wave of threats arrives. Expanded, the Space Marines without their god. There are approximately 1,000 Space Marine chapters at any given time in the Imperium. Each chapter maintains roughly 1,000 battle brothers, producing a total fighting force of around 1 million of the finest individual warriors in human history. They are genetically engineered to be superhuman, psychologically conditioned to be unshakable, trained from early adolescence for war, and nothing but war, and equipped with the best weapons and armor that millennia of Imperial technology can produce. In any objective military assessment, a single Space Marine is more than a match for any ordinary human soldier. A chapter's worth is a force that can conduct an entire planetary campaign without support. The Space Marines are the most durable part of the Imperium. When everything else fails, the logistics, the politics, the faith, the Space Marines can still function because they were designed to function in exactly those conditions. Their self-sufficiency is a feature, not an accident. Fortress monasteries are built to sustain a chapter indefinitely, without outside support. Each chapter maintains its own fleet, its own supply train, its own armories. The genoseed that defines each chapter can be cultivated internally, though the process is slow and the risks of unchecked mutation are real without the oversight of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But the Space Marines are not immune to the Emperor's death. They are affected in ways that are less immediately practical and more fundamental, questions of identity, theology, and the psychic consequences of their connection to the Emperor's legacy. Genoseed is not merely genetic material. It is a collection of specialized organs that grant the Space Marine his superhuman capabilities, and it is derived ultimately from genetic templates established by the Emperor himself, refined through the Primarchs whose lineages each chapter belongs to. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Mechanicus has maintained a process of testing genoseed against those templates, identifying and correcting mutations before they can compound through generations. The Emperor's presence has been understood to be part of what stabilizes those templates, not directly, not mechanically, but in the psychic sense that his existence in the warp provides a kind of reference point for the biological processes that the genoseed expresses. When the Emperor dies, the long-term implications for genoseed stability are unknown. This is genuinely uncharted territory. There has been no period in Space Marine history when the Emperor was not present to provide that psychic reference. The mutations that have plagued certain chapters throughout their existence, the Black Rage of the Blood Angels, the Canis Helix instability in the Space Wolves, the various smaller idiosyncrasies in dozens of other chapters, may worsen. New mutations may emerge. The Mechanicus will no longer have a pure template to check against, because the template was the Emperor, and the Emperor is gone. For the Blood Angels, this is potentially the most catastrophic consequence of all. The Black Rage is already a death sentence, Blood angels who fall to it cannot be recovered. They experience the final moments of Sanguinius's life on an endless loop, driven to a battle madness that cannot be turned off, and that burns through a warrior's body and mind within hours or days. The only mercy the chapter can offer them is to use them in the most desperate charges, to let them die fighting rather than dying confused and suffering in a cell. A significant fraction of every generation of blood angels is lost to the rage. Without the Emperor's stabilizing presence, and more directly, without the hope that some chapters maintain that the Emperor might someday be able to address the genocide flaws directly, given sufficient recovery, the Black Rage will likely accelerate its progression through the Blood Angels' ranks. Combined with the increased warp turbulence and the specific resonance that Sanguinius's memory has with the warp events following the Emperor's death, the Blood Angels may find the Rage spreading faster and more widely than ever before. In the worst projection, the Blood Angels cease to function as a military chapter within a generation, consumed from within by a curse that the Emperor's death has made permanent and unmanageable. The Space Wolves, the Unforgiven, the other chapters with their own particular relationships to the Emperor's legacy, each has its own version of this vulnerability. And beyond the biological, there is the psychological. Space Marines are conditioned to believe in the Emperor, not in the soft devotional way that the common citizen believes, but in a harder, more personal way that is woven into their training and their identity. The Emperor, D, is the reason they exist. He made the Primarchs. The Primarchs made the Legions, and the Legions became the chapters, and the chapters became the guardians of the Imperium. Every time a Space Marine recites the litanies of battle, every time a chaplain delivers his oration before an assault, every time a battle brother survives something that by any calculation should have killed him and calls it the Emperor's will, all of this is built on the belief that the Emperor exists and that his existence matters. The chaplains will adapt the doctrine. They always have. The flexibility of the faith under pressure is one of its underrated strengths. But even the most adaptable chaplain cannot simply paper over the fact that the genocide may be changing, that the warp is more hostile, that the light they have been fighting toward for 10,000 years has gone out. It will take time. In that time, morale affects, subtle, hard to quantify, the difference between a warrior who fights with absolute certainty and one who fights with determined doubt, will affect performance in battles where the margin of victory is already measured in fractions. There is also the question of purpose. The Space Marines were created by the Emperor to conquer the galaxy and hold it. The Great Crusade was the intended culmination of that purpose, a completed human civilization, unified and defended. The heresy made that impossible, and the chapters have spent 10,000 years operating in a permanent emergency that prevents the original goal from ever being achieved. They fight because they fight, because there is always something that needs fighting, because their nature and their training leave them no other option. When the Emperor dies and the Imperium begins to fragment, some chapters will find their sense of purpose shifting. The most practically minded will continue to fight whoever threatens the populations in their immediate operational area. The mission simplifies in the absence of the broader strategic framework. You fight what is in front of you, and you protect what you can protect. This is not a lesser form of the Space Marine purpose, and many chapters will find it clarifying rather than diminishing. But for chapters whose identity is built around something more theological, around the idea that they are specifically the Emperor's warriors, that their actions have cosmic significance in the Emperor's plan, the lack of an Emperor to serve is an identity crisis with teeth. Some of these chapters will pursue the most extreme available responses. Self-destructive last stands that are as much about ending in a manner consistent with their mythology as about tactical logic, or desperate searches for meaning in heresy, or in the alternatives that the absence of the imperial faith opens up. The Dark Angels will manage their secrets in greater silence than ever, in a galaxy where the institutions that once threatened to expose them have collapsed and the monitoring mechanisms are gone. Whether the resolution of the Unforgiven, the ancient quest to redeem the fallen, becomes more urgent or less so in a galaxy where the question of what the Emperor's original intention was no longer has a living authority to answer it is a question the Rock's inner council will be arguing about in the deepest chambers long after the outer galaxy has moved on. The Grey Knights will fight. That is what they do, and the demonic incursions following the Emperor's death give them more to fight than any previous generation has faced. Whether they fight in the Emperor's name as they have always fought, or in the name of something they are still trying to define, the practical consequence is the same. The finest demon hunters in human history will be fully committed in a galaxy where demonic incursion is the new baseline reality. The Brotherhood will be consumed by its mission in a way it has never been consumed before. Individual members will be lost at rates the chapter cannot sustain indefinitely. Replacements will be harder to find and train in a galaxy where the organized psychic testing and cultivation infrastructure has collapsed. And yet they will endure longer than most institutions, because they were designed specifically for this for this kind of enemy, for exactly the conditions that follow the Emperor's death. The Grey Knights are the Imperium's most terrible preparation for an eventuality it spent 10,000 years hoping would never occur. Expanded, the machinery of faith, the ecclesiarchy, after the God Emperor, the Adeptus Ministorum, the ecclesiarchy, the institutional church of the imperial cult, and is the largest religious organization in human history. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. It is the actual largest religious organization in the history of the human species in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, an institution that manages the spiritual lives of hundreds of trillions of people across 1 million worlds. Its priesthood numbers in the billions. Its cathedrals exist on every inhabited world in the Imperium. Its hymns are known in some form by every human being who has been through the imperial education system, which is to say, virtually everyone. The rituals of the imperial cult, the daily prayer, the feast days, the rites of passage, the services for the war dead, are so deeply embedded in everyday life on most imperial worlds that people perform them more out of cultural habit than deliberate devotion. The way people in many historical societies have maintained religious practices long after literal belief has faded. The ecclesiarchy's power is built entirely on one claim, that the Emperor is a god, that he lives, that he guides and protects his people, and that the institution of the church speaks in his name. When the Emperor dies, that claim is no longer accurate in the straightforward sense. The ecclesiarch, the head of the ecclesiarchy, one of the High Lords of Terra, will respond first by denying. This is both psychologically natural and institutionally necessary. The Church has no crisis management protocol for the death of its God, because the Church was built on the assumption that its God does not die. There is no doctrinal tradition for this event. There is no scripture that addresses it. There are 1,000 years of accumulated theological writing that presuppose his immortality, and the entire structure of imperial religious law and practice is built on that presupposition. The immediate denial will be sincere in many cases. Many priests genuinely cannot imagine the Emperor dying. The concept is literally beyond their frame of reference. When communications from Terra stop arriving, when the Astronomicon goes dark, when the physical evidence accumulates that something enormous has happened, the instinctive response will be interpretation within the existing framework. It is a test. It is a mystery of faith. The Emperor works in ways that mortals cannot comprehend. The darkness is temporary. The light will return. This interpretation will sustain the faith of many people for a long time, longer than a purely rational analysis would predict, because faith is not a purely rational phenomenon. People who believe deeply in something are not easily argued out of it by evidence, particularly when the alternative to belief is the acknowledgement that the system of meaning that has organized their entire life is no longer reliable. The comfort of the familiar doctrine, maintained against evidence, is a human constant across all of history. But the comfort will not hold everywhere. On worlds where the practical consequences of the Emperor's death arrive first, where the supply chains break before the theological questions are even raised, where the warp incursions make the abstract question of divine protection suddenly very concrete, the faith will be tested in ways that theology cannot address. A priest trying to explain why the God Emperor's protection seems to be failing, while demons tear through the walls of his church, is working with a theological toolkit that was never designed for the situation he is standing in. The Sisters of Battle, the Adepta Sororitas, the military arm of the ecclesiarchy, will maintain their function better than almost any other institution in the immediate aftermath. They are organized, capable, and their faith is of a particular quality, not comfortable and routine, but tested and personal, forged in the same way a blade is forged, through pressure and heat, and the requirement to make it real because your life depends on it. Sisters of Battle do not maintain their faith because it is convenient or culturally expected. They maintain it because it is the thing that allows them to do what they do, and what they do in the weeks after the Emperor's death is exactly what the setting needs most. They hold lines. Where the Guard regiments are fragmented and isolated, where the Space Marine chapters are managing their own internal questions, the Sisters are fighting with the focused intensity of people who have understood, in an existential rather than theoretical sense, that the Emperor's light requires its servants to be the source of it, rather than merely recipients of it. Their theology, in the aftermath, may be the one that survives with the most integrity, not because it is comforting, but because it never required comfort to sustain it. Across the broader ecclesiarchy, the fragmentation will follow predictable fault lines. The conservative faction will attempt to maintain the literal doctrine with increasing rigidity. The Emperor is immortal. Whatever has happened is not what it seems. The Astronomicon will return. Those who say otherwise are heretics, and heretics must be purged. This faction will have genuine power in the short term because of its organizational control and its control of the physical assets of the Church, the cathedrals, the reliquaries, the sacred texts, the financial resources. But power maintained by increasingly forceful suppression of dissent tends to create more dissent than it suppresses, particularly when the material conditions that the doctrine is trying to describe diverge increasingly from observable reality. The Reform faction, smaller, more intellectually sophisticated, in some cases drawing on older theological traditions that were suppressed precisely because they were less comforting than the mainstream doctrine, will argue for a reinterpretation. The Emperor was always more than his physical form. The God Emperor cannot be bounded by the material. His death, if real, is a transformation. His spirit, or the part of it that was cast off into the warp, is not subject to the same limitations as his body. The faith should not collapse because a body has stopped functioning. It should evolve, as all living traditions evolve, into something adequate to the present moment. This faction will be persecuted by the conservative faction. It will survive the persecution in the places where practical conditions make the conservative position literally untenable. And over generations, not years, not decades, but over the slower time of cultural change, it will become the foundation of the new religious forms that succeed the imperial cult in those regions of space where the Imperium's successor states develop their own identities. Some of those successor faiths will be recognizable as derivatives of the imperial cult. Others will diverge in ways that would horrify the original ecclesiarchy, incorporating elements of older traditions or responding to local warp conditions in ways that amount to functional worship of entities the Inquisition would have burned people for acknowledging. This is the fate of religions when their central institution collapses. The local variations that existed everywhere, but were kept beneath the surface by the pressure of orthodoxy, suddenly become visible, and the diversity that the institution suppressed reasserts itself in 1,000 different forms. Some of those forms will be dangerous. Some will be very dangerous. The ruinous powers have always worked through religion more efficiently than through any other mechanism, because religion shapes how people interpret experience, and experience in the 41st millennium, post-Emperor, is going to be generating a great deal of data that requires interpretation. But some of those forms will be genuinely beautiful. The history of human religion is full of moments where the collapse of an institution revealed something more essential beneath it, something that the institution had been both protecting and obscuring. In the darkness after the Emperor, on the worlds where people are trying to make sense of what has happened and what they should do about it, there will be priests and prophets and ordinary people of extraordinary conviction who manage to articulate something worth holding on to. They will be the seeds of what comes next, carried on whatever wind the collapsed Imperium leaves behind. Expanded, the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Omniscience problem. The Adeptus Mechanicus is the institution that understands the Golden Throne's failure most precisely because they are the ones who have been measuring it. They have known for centuries that the throne is failing. The reports exist, meticulously maintained in data vaults on Mars and in the various Mechanicus temples across the Imperium, encoded in binary and hexadecimal and Mechanicus ciphercants so dense that decoding them requires both specialist training and specific authorization clearances. These reports do not use the word failing. They describe suboptimal degradation indices and irrecoverable efficiency loss in tertiary and secondary support systems, and projected terminal function cessation within a range of 40 to 90 standard years, pending current maintenance protocols and absence of unforeseen catastrophic degradation events. The language is precise and the meaning is unmistakable to anyone who can parse it. The Fabricator General of Mars has known for generations, through a chain of Fabricators General who have each received the briefings and added their own marginal notes and passed the file on to their successors with the same private despair. The Omnissiah, the machine god of the Mechanicus theology, whom the mainstream of the Adeptus Mechanicus equates with the Emperor himself, is going to cease to exist in his current form within the lifetimes of the current generation of tech priests. What this means theologically for the Adeptus Mechanicus is a question that the institution has been very carefully not examining directly, because it is the kind of question that does not have a comfortable answer, and the Adeptus Mechanicus is not, institutionally, an organization that handles discomfort well. The Mechanicus is built around the idea of cold logic applied to all problems, but the problem of what happens to a civilization's machine god when the physical form he inhabits stops working is not a problem that cold logic resolves. It is a theological problem with no solution that the existing doctrine can provide. The Fabricator General's response to the Emperor's death will depend enormously on which individual holds the position at the time. The Mechanicus has seen Fabricators General who were theological conservatives, who would interpret the event through the lens of the Omnissiah's transcendence. The Emperor/Omnissiah has transitioned to a new and higher state of existence, and the Adeptus Mechanicus's duty is to pursue understanding of that new state. And it has seen Fabricators General who were practical rationalists, whose response would be more directly focused on what the Mechanicus can salvage from the situation in terms of technical resources, political positioning, and the preservation of the accumulated knowledge base that is, in the Mechanicus's own theology, the sacred legacy of the Omnissiah's creative drive. Mars will survive the Emperor's death as an institution more intact than almost any other. The Red Planet is the most technically capable world in the Imperium, self-sufficient in ways that most worlds are not, militarily powerful in its own right, with its Titan legions and Skitarii armies and the navy vessels that serve its own fleets. The Fabricator General will be uncomfortable, but they will be uncomfortable in a functioning fortress world that has centuries of supplies and the most sophisticated manufacturing capacity in human history. The question is not whether Mars survives. The question is what Mars does. The Mechanicus controls the secrets of most Imperial technology, the Space Marine armor that keeps Astartes alive, the Imperial Guard's Chimera transports and Leman Russ battle tanks, the Navy's warships, the agricultural technology that feeds agri-worlds, the water purification systems that keep hive worlds from dying of thirst. Every significant piece of technology in the Imperium has a Mechanicus component somewhere in its supply or maintenance chain. In the absence of a central Imperial authority, the Fabricator General effectively controls the tap on an enormous portion of the Imperium's capacity to sustain itself. Whether that control is used with the benevolent intent of maintaining human civilization, or with the institutional self-interest of an organization whose primary loyalty has always been to Mars rather than to Terra, or with the philosophical obsessiveness of a theology that has its own particular goals regarding the recovery of pre-heresy technology, that will be one of the most consequential questions in the post-Emperor galaxy. There are records, deep in the Mechanicus data vaults, of technologies that were never deployed. Experiments begun during the Great Crusade that the Emperor himself suspended, whose suspension was maintained out of deference to his authority. Ancient designs that were judged too dangerous or too destabilizing for the political environment of a functioning Imperium, but that become more attractive when the political environment has collapsed anyway. The Omnissiah Emperor's restrictions are difficult to maintain when the Omnissiah is dead, and the restrictions were never written down in language accessible to anyone outside the most senior Mechanicus councils. The knowledge of how to build certain things does not die with the Emperor. It is archived. It has always been archived. And in the chaos that follows the Emperor's death, the archivists begin, very quietly, to have conversations they have not been able to have before. Some of what they build in those conversations will save lives. The Mechanicus at its best is capable of genuine creative problem-solving that produces technologies adequate to the challenges of the moment, and the challenges of the moment are enormous. new navigation systems that do not depend on the Astronomicon, new communications technologies that bypass the astropathic network, new weapons and defenses adequate to the increase in demonic incursion. Some of what they build will be something else entirely. The Mechanicus has always had factions that pushed against the restrictions, that looked at the technologies of the dark age of technology and wanted to recover them without the cautious gatekeeping that the Emperor's implicit oversight provided. Those factions have always existed. They have been tolerated in small doses because their drive produces results. They have been contained in large doses because the results they would produce at full scale include several categories of existential risk that the Emperor's presence was in part designed to prevent. Without that containment, those factions will grow. They will produce things. Some of those things will be extraordinary. Some will be catastrophic. And the Mechanicus, focused on its own theological and technological preoccupations, may not always be the most reliable judge of which is which. Expanded, the Inquisition, searching for enemies in the dark. Of all the institutions the Emperor's death affects, the Inquisition faces perhaps the most profound identity crisis. And that is saying something in a field that includes the Church losing its God. The Inquisition exists to protect the Imperium from threats within: heresy, mutation, alien infiltration, demonic corruption. Its agents operate with near unlimited authority. An Inquisitor can requisition any resource, override any other authority, condemn any person or any world based on their personal judgment alone. The institution is deliberately designed to function without the checks and balances that most governing structures require, because the threats it combats do not respect those checks and balances. And a response that is constrained by due process will always be slower than a threat that is not. The Inquisition's power derives from the same source as the High Lord's authority, the Emperor's mandate. Inquisitors act in the Emperor's name. Their authority is divine, delegated from the living God who rules the Imperium. Without the living God, the theological basis for that authority evaporates in exactly the same way it evaporates for the High Lords, and faster, because the Inquisition's authority is more absolute, and therefore more dependent on the legitimacy that makes that absolutism acceptable to the people subject to it. In practice, Inquisitors have always operated on the edge of what their authority technically permits. Many have been accused of overreach. Inquisitorial conclaves have judged their own members as rogue agents and hunted them down. The internal politics of the Inquisition are famously complex and occasionally violent. But even these internal conflicts have been conducted within a shared understanding that the institution itself is legitimate, that the authority being exercised is real, that the Emperor's mandate, however it is interpreted, provides a foundation that cannot be questioned without questioning everything. When the Emperor dies, the foundation is questionable. And in an institution whose members are specifically trained to question everything, trained to assume that the most dangerous threats are the ones that appear most legitimate, that the most reliable evidence can be falsified, that the institutions with the most power are the ones most worth scrutinizing. The removal of the theological foundation does not produce orderly doubt. It produces an avalanche. The Inquisition will fracture along lines that have always been present but were previously contained by shared institutional identity. The Puritan factions, those who believe the Inquisition's mandate is absolute, that any compromise with heresy or alien is unacceptable, that the standards of purity must be maintained even if maintaining them requires destroying significant portions of the Imperium's own population, will see the Emperor's death as both validation and emergency. Validation, because the suffering of the moment confirms that deviation from purity has consequences. Emergency, because the moment demands more ruthless application of their principles rather than less. The radical factions, those who believe that fighting fire with fire is sometimes necessary, that understanding heresy deeply enough to combat it requires engaging with it, that the end of preserving humanity justifies, means that orthodoxy would condemn, will see the same moment as an opportunity to stop pretending that the orthodox toolkit is adequate. In a galaxy where the warp is bleeding through everywhere, where the old barriers are down, where the chaos gods are pressing in from all sides, the radical argument that you need to understand and use the powers of the enemy to fight it gains a rhetorical weight it never quite had before. Whether the powers in question will cooperate with being used rather than consuming the user is a separate question. And between these extremes, the majority of inquisitors who simply want to do their jobs in the most practically effective way possible will find themselves unable to work because every tool they normally reach for, the authority of their inquisitorial seal, the support of the Ordo's infrastructure, the cooperation of local governors who fear the consequences of non-compliance, has been degraded or destroyed. An inquisitor operating in the field, far from any conclave or support structure, in the weeks following the emperor's death, discovers quickly that their warrant is worth exactly as much as the person they are presenting it to believes it to be worth. In most cases, that is now much less than it was. The planetary governor who once responded to an inquisitorial visit by immediately providing any resource requested and bowing out of the inquisitor's way is now a planetary governor who is dealing with a food crisis and a military collapse, and has no clear line to any authority that could either enforce the inquisitor's demands or punish non-compliance. The seal is a piece of metal. The authority it represents is only present if the person looking at it believes the authority is real. Inquisitors are, to their credit, trained for exactly this kind of situation. They are not people who fold under pressure. They are people who operate in the worst possible conditions and find a way to function anyway. In the aftermath of the emperor's death, many inquisitors will simply continue doing what they do, identifying threats, eliminating them, protecting populations, hunting heretics, without waiting for institutional support that is not coming. Their effectiveness will vary based on their personal resources and networks, and those networks will become enormously more important than official authority in a galaxy where official authority has collapsed. The danger is that in the absence of institutional oversight, the individual inquisitor's personal judgment becomes the only check on their own power. And individual judgment, however excellent, is not a reliable substitute for institutional accountability. The history of the Inquisition is full of inquisitors whose personal judgment took them to places that their institutions eventually had to address by force. Without the institutions, there is no address by force. There is only the inquisitor, and whatever they have decided is necessary, and no mechanism for reconsidering it. In the post-Emperor galaxy, the most dangerous individuals may not be Chaos Space Marines or Demon Prince or Ancient Xenos powers awakening from their sleep. They may be inquisitors with perfect certainty and no oversight, pursuing their definition of purity in a galaxy that can no longer tell them to stop. Expanded, the last defenders, what remains in the ruin, let us end not with institutions but with individuals. The setting's lore has always been most powerful at the individual scale, the single voice in the dark, the one warrior choosing to stand when everything rational says to run, the moment of human decision that determines whether a world survives or falls. In the ruins of the Emperor's Imperium, there will be many such moments. There will be the guard sergeant who has been out of contact with any command authority for 8 months, who is still maintaining her firing line against an orc advance in a ruined city on a world whose name does not appear in any surviving strategic document. Her unit has shrunk from a full company to 11 people. They have repaired their lasguns with materials scavenged from destroyed vehicles. They have eaten whatever they could find for weeks. They no longer know whether anyone else is fighting on this world, or whether they are the last defenders of something that no one else remembers. She does not know if the Emperor is alive or dead. She knows the orcs are in the next block, and she knows that if she retreats, the civilians sheltering in the manufactorum behind her will be consumed. She holds the line. She has always held the line. She will keep holding it until she cannot. There will be the tech priest who has been maintaining a water purification system on a world of 40 million people since before the communications went silent. She is old, and her augmentations are failing in small ways, and she cannot get replacement parts anymore because the forge world that produced them is no longer responding to any signal. She has improvised repairs with materials that the Mechanicus would consider heretical if anyone from the Mechanicus were present to object. They work. The water remains clean. The 40 million people continue to survive. She logs her repairs in the maintenance record she has kept for 60 years in the same careful notation she was trained to use, because the record matters even if no one will ever read it. There will be the priest who has lost his faith and found something in its place that he cannot name. He does not know if the Emperor lives. He does not know if any of the promises the Church made were true. What he knows is that on the day the warp touched his city and the demons came through the cathedral walls and his congregation ran screaming, he stood in the doorway and called down something, prayer, desperation, force of will, whatever you want to call it. And the demons stopped. Not permanently, not heroically, just long enough for the people behind him to get out. He does not know what he reached for in that moment. He does not know what answered. But whatever the distinction between faith and desperation, something was on the other side of it, and people lived because he stood there. There will be the Space Marine who has not received new orders in 2 years and has spent those 2 years doing the only thing he knows how to do, which is protecting the people in his operational area from whatever threatens them. He has fought Chaos cultists and an Orc warband, and 3 separate encounters with things that had no names in any bestiary he carries. He has not slept in the way humans sleep, because he is not human in the usual sense. He has not doubted in the way humans doubt, because his training was designed to make doubt functional rather than paralyzing. He does not know if the Emperor is alive. He knows the people in the valley below the mountain where he is currently positioned are alive, and that they were not alive a year ago before he climbed down from that mountain to help them. That will do for now. There will be the astropath who survived the shockwave of the Emperor's death through sheer stubbornness, whose abilities are changed and strange and painful, and no longer function the way they were trained to. She has developed new capacities she cannot explain. She senses things in the warp that no training described to her, presences she cannot identify, something very far away that is very quiet and very steady. She does not know what it is. She has started to describe it in her private journal, carefully, in language she does not share with anyone else, because language for it does not exist yet. It is small, she writes, like a star that is very far away, but it does not flicker. These people, the sergeant and the tech priest and the space marine and the astropath, are not extraordinary by the setting's standards. They are not primarchs. They are not ancient heroes of legend. They are the level of person the setting produces in enormous numbers, the people who do not appear in the history books because history books record the large-scale movements rather than the individual acts that those movements are made of. They are also, in the truest sense, the answer to the question of what survives. Not the Imperium, not the institution, not the Aquila-stamped bureaucracy and the cathedral-organized faith and the tithe-based economy and the administratum-managed everything. Those things are ending, in various ways, at various speeds, across 1,000,000 different worlds. What survives is the decision to try. The choice to hold the line when retreating would be rational. The choice to maintain the water system when no one would notice if it failed. The choice to stand in the doorway. The choice to keep fighting for the people in the valley, even without orders or certainty or theological comfort. These choices are not made because the Emperor is alive. They are not made because a god commanded them. They are made because the human beings making them have decided, in full knowledge of how bad things are, that they are worth making, that the people behind them are worth defending, that the darkness is not the last word. This is the thing that the Emperor's story, for all its millennial scale and cosmic stakes, has always been about at its core. Not the machinery of civilization, or the structures of power, or the theological architecture of a galactic religion. The human decision, made in the worst possible circumstances, to be something better than the circumstances suggest is possible. The Emperor made that decision 10,000 years ago when he chose the throne over death. He may be making it still, in whatever the Star Child has become, and in 1,000,000 small moments across a galaxy in the dark, the people who carry his legacy, whether they know it or not, are making it too.